It is 9 a.m. and we open the proceedings. Item 1, debate on foreign policy. Before we begin the debate, I'd like to welcome representatives from the diplomatic corps joining us today for the debate on foreign policy at the Swedish Riksdag. You're very welcome indeed. Debating rules. The foreign policy debate is divided into two parts. First, an opening part with the Minister for Foreign Affairs and representatives from each party, followed by a second part with other speakers who would have expressed the wish to take the floor. The Minister for Foreign Affairs opens by presenting the government's statement of foreign policy, and this address may take a maximum of 20 minutes. This is then followed by speeches from the other parties in the order of the size of each party, at a maximum speaking time of 8 minutes. There's a free right of rejoinder for all of these speeches. The dueling method is applied with rejoinders lasting for no longer than 2 minutes and then 1 minute, total of 6 minutes per duel. The speeches are made from the rostrum and the rejoinders are made from the speaker's chairs in front of the rostrum. And I now like to give the floor to Malmer Stenegard for the Moderate Party, Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Lana Chanorska was a journalist. She was an LGBTIQ activist, an artist and a drone pilot, and she didn't need to fight. But like so many other Ukrainians, she was unable to just sit and stand by and watch as her loved ones were afflicted by Russia's war of aggression. On New Year's Day this year, she shared a tangerine with her friend Ignatius. He joked that he would tell the world about that lovely girl that he had shared a tangerine with. 10 minutes later, Lana died in his arms after having been hit by a Russian drone. And now Ignatius is doing just what he said he would do. He is telling the world about Lana. When I met him a couple of weeks ago, he asked me to think of Lana when I think of Ukraine and of all the people who, just like Lana, have given their lives for Ukraine and for a free, democratic Europe. Mr. Speaker, we are living in times of upheaval at a crossroads. The security policy framework, international rules of free trade that have made countries like Sweden secure, prosperous, are being challenged, and we're seeing serious violations of international law. The government is addressing these developments with clarity of vision and decisive action. In its first statement of government policy, the Prime Minister spoke about the need to redirect foreign policy, security policy, in order to address the threats facing Sweden and Europe. Sweden was in the process of becoming a NATO member, increasing its support to Ukraine, reforming development aid and deepening cooperation with countries in its immediate area. The government has delivered on all these because we have given them priority. Foreign and security policy are all about a will, but equally actually also about a choice. We have chosen to uphold the security of Sweden and the Swedish people. Mr. Speaker, Russia's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine has been ongoing for almost as long as the First World War. How the war ends will affect security in Europe for at least a generation to come. Support to Ukraine continues, therefore, to be the government's foremost foreign policy priority. We support Ukraine's efforts in the current negotiations together with European and US partners, and we are ready to take responsibility if an agreement can be concluded. In addition to extensive support, Sweden will at that point be ready to contribute to a multinational reassurance force. However, as long as Russia's aggression continues, Sweden will remain committed to our two-point plan: more support to Ukraine and increased pressure on Russia. Support to Ukraine, this is a moral obligation, an investment in Europe's security, on its independence and future. Last year, according to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, Sweden, Denmark and Norway were the countries that provided the most military support to Ukraine in relation to their GDP. Sweden's overall support, so the military support and development aid, is something that saves lives and strengthens Ukraine's resilience. I would like to thank the Chamber for its broad support for the cause of Ukraine. It is a demonstration of Swedish strength that sends a clear signal to the rest of the world that Sweden supports Ukraine and will do so for as long as it takes. Mr. Speaker, we know that Russia's aims extend far beyond Ukraine. Sweden and Europe need to be prepared for a long-term, far-reaching confrontation with Russia. Together with our allies and partners, we will constrain Russia from a position of strength. NATO's deterrence and collective defence capabilities are fundamental pillars of this policy of constraint. Sweden's NATO membership makes our country more secure. We are not standing alone in troubled times. Our overriding interest as an ally is to maintain the political and military credibility of NATO's Article 5. NATO is now facing a shift that will force Europe to assume a far greater responsibility for its own security. And Sweden is prepared to take that responsibility as something that we demonstrated since we became members through extensive contributions on land, at sea and in the air, around the Baltic Sea, in the high north and along NATO's eastern flank. In May, Sweden will host the informal meeting of NATO Ministers of Foreign Affairs in Helsingborg, a town where the shadow fleet can be seen on an almost daily basis on its way to less scrupulous buyers who are filling Russia's war coffers. Sweden's military presence in Latvia is of palpable significance. Now we have also taken on responsibility as a framework nation for NATO's forward land forces in Finland, which demonstrates the increased significance of security in the Arctic region in the High North. Sweden will also contribute with fighter aircraft to NATO Operation Arctic Sentry. Efforts to develop a new Swedish Arctic strategy are ongoing. Mr. Speaker, Sweden and the United States are united by family ties that go back generations. The US and Europe are also linked by two of the world's most integrated economies and by the world's foremost defence alliance. The United States is crucial to Swedish and European security and prosperity. However, Europe's relations with the US are now entering a new era. It is self-evident that the US is increasingly acting in a way that undermines confidence and runs counter to Europe's values regarding global cooperation as well as international law. Let me therefore emphasize what is self-evident. Sweden will not compromise on the territorial integrity of our neighbours. It is only Denmark and Greenland that can decide on matters that concern Denmark and Greenland. Sweden's bilateral cooperation with the US continues to be strong. We have developed cooperation in areas such as defence and space, and we have also opened consulates general in San Francisco and Houston. Now that the transatlantic link is being changed and redefined, we must strengthen Europe. The government is therefore developing closer relations with allies and partners in Sweden's immediate area. We are a driving force in Nordic and Nordic-Baltic cooperation, which has never been deeper. We are strengthening security cooperation between the countries around the Baltic Sea. Poland's choice of Sweden as a partner to build up its submarine capability creates new opportunities for and between our countries. This shows that Swedish defence industry is also a valuable asset for allies and partners. We have also strengthened our strategic partnerships with Germany, the United Kingdom, France and Canada. Mr. Speaker, in this period of upheaval, there are certain constants. One is the EU, a community of values, and Sweden's most important foreign policy platform. Time and again, the EU has demonstrated its collective strength during a crisis. The EU is our best way that we can use to defend democracy, freedom and international law. Sweden would like to see a more geopolitical and resolute EU. The foreign and security policy dimension needs to be reinforced, and it must be possible for a qualified majority to take more decisions. Sweden welcomes the emerging defence dimension in the EU. The EU is playing an increasingly important role in strengthening the defence industry, military mobility and civil preparedness in Europe. The EU is crucial for robust and long-term support to Ukraine, as well as for a policy of constraint against Russia. In the EU, Sweden has been a driving force in advocating sanctions against Russia's shadow fleet in order to reduce Russia's energy-related income and to use Russia's frozen assets to support Ukraine. Sweden wishes to expand sanctions against Belarus because of its domestic repression and support for Russia's aggression. The government supports the Belarusian people on their path to a free and democratic Belarus. Many countries are now knocking on the EU's door. They want to be part of a free Europe, part of the world's largest single market, and it lies in our interest to help the candidate countries to actually progress and towards joining the Union. The government is pushing for additional steps towards EU membership for Ukraine and Moldova, both of which have made impressive efforts as regards reforms. In the Western Balkans, Albania and Montenegro are making great progress. Sweden deeply laments the current developments in Georgia. At the same time, we are determined to continue supporting the democratic and European-minded forces that are present there. The Swedish government continues to support democratic developments in Armenia and welcomes Armenia's efforts towards closer cooperation with the EU.
Mr. Speaker, the developments in the Middle East give cause for both hope and concern. The UN Security Council resolution that approved the US peace plan for Gaza is confirmation of the widespread international support for peace in the region. It is essential to protect civilians, allow unobstructed access to humanitarian aid, and ensure meaningful Palestinian participation in the reconstruction of Gaza. Hamas must be disarmed and has no place in the future governance of Gaza. The serious development with an expansion of settlements and settler violence against Palestinian civilians in the West Bank must stop, and Sweden continues to push for additional EU sanctions against extremist settlers and extremist Israeli ministers who are pursuing illegal settlement policies. Ultimately, what is needed is a negotiated two-state solution based on international law. This is the only sustainable solution in which Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in peace, freedom, and democracy. Iran and its proxies have been weakened, but the country, Iran, still bears a large part of the responsibility for the negative developments in the region and for the security risks in the West. The situation in Iran is horrific. The government condemns the extensive deadly violence used against peaceful protesters and the widespread arbitrary arrests that have been made in the wake of the recent protests in the country. We fully support the brave Iranian women and men who are exercising their freedom of expression and assembly. Sweden welcomes the EU's political agreement to list the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. This is an issue that Sweden has long pursued, supported by consensus in the Riksdag. And in Syria, the fall of the Assad regime has meant an opportunity for the Syrian people to finally shape their future. And Sweden has been clear in its expectations of the transitional government to include all Syrians in the reconstruction of the new Syria. The participation of women and ethnic and religious groups must be ensured. We expect the right of ethnic and religious groups, such as the Kurds, Christians, Alawites, and the Druze, to be respected. Sweden will continue to underscore the importance of accountability for the crimes committed both recently and in the past in Syria. Sweden and the EU are increasing their support now that, despite the fragile situation, there are better prospects for a brighter future for the Syrian people, including the possibility of eventually returning home. Mr. Speaker, the Asia-Pacific region is where the greatest economic growth is expected to arise. The security of Asia and Europe is also becoming increasingly interlinked. We're strengthening our cooperation with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. All are important NATO partners. We're intensifying our dialogue with the ASEAN countries, and we are developing our partnership with India. The trade agreement and partnership in security and defence between the EU and India brings on a new era of cooperation. China is the world's second largest economy and a leading nation in research and technological development, and at the same time the country is under authoritarian rule and has growing geopolitical ambitions. We welcome dialogue and cooperation with China wherever possible and where it's in line with our interests and values, such as to promote trade on equal terms and tackling climate change. We continue to call attention to human rights violations together with the rest of the EU, and Sweden's relations with China are and will continue to be anchored in a European strategy. China's conduct towards Taiwan is a cause for concern, and threats of military action are unacceptable. China's enabling of Russia's war in Ukraine has a direct negative impact on the security of Sweden and of Europe. Mr. Speaker, global challenges cannot be resolved solely with our allies or closest like-minded partners. Together with like-minded countries in Asia, Africa and Latin America that care about and uphold common institutions and rules, we can create a force that does not compete but which will unite us. A reform of the UN Security Council is urgently needed. Sweden supports fairer representation of all continents in the Security Council and will push for the addition of more permanent and non-permanent members. Veto power should be limited. Nearly 65 years have passed since the death of UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, and Sweden continues to support the UN investigation that aims to clarify the circumstances surrounding his death. In trade policy, Sweden is working to defend the rules-based order and maintain EU unity. The free trade agreements between the EU and India and between the EU and Mercosur are progress for free trade globally. Swift entry into force of the Mercosur agreement is in Sweden's interest and is backed by all the parties that support our government. I can only regret that a large part of the opposition are working against the agreement at a time when we need to forge more ties, not fewer, with the rest of the world. We have substantially raised the bar in terms of our ambitions for our trade and investment in particular when it comes to exports of defence equipment, and we see an increased need for international cooperation at the nexus of technology, innovation, trade and security. It is important to reduce the vulnerabilities that result from unilateral economic dependencies. Only a growing economy will allow us to equip our defence and ensure preparedness in tougher times. A strong Swedish economy builds security in uncertain times. Mr. Speaker, the development aid strategy for Ukraine is Sweden's largest bilateral strategy ever. This year, the Swedish government is increasing its development aid to Ukraine to at least 10 billion Swedish kronor. At the same time, Sweden continues to be a generous donor to the world's most vulnerable people. This is particularly demonstrated by its humanitarian aid and support for sexual and reproductive health and rights. From Gaza to Sudan to Ukraine, Sweden continues to make a difference where humanitarian needs are greatest. Sweden is one of the world's most generous donors of climate aid, and by chairing the board of the Green Climate Fund in 2026, we're continuing to support international climate action. Only through global cooperation can climate change be tackled. Mr. Speaker, gender equality is a core value of Sweden's foreign policy. It's a human rights issue and a priority area for Sweden in the UN and for our development aid. And under Sweden's presidency last year, the UN Women Executive Board, which we presided, enhanced its work, and the organization's strategic direction was enhanced. Sweden's work is essential to advance women's and girls' rights and empowerment, and Sweden's development aid must help increase access to prenatal and maternity care, comprehensive sexuality education, and measures to combat all forms of sexual and gender-based violence. This is an important part of our broad commitment to global health. Mr. Speaker, during this electoral period, Johan Flodera, Saida Sisi, Joakim Medin, and Galina Krasnoyanskaya have been released and have been able to return to Sweden. David Isaak, Gui Minhai and Ahmed Reza Jalali must also be reunited with their families. I am the first Swedish Minister for Foreign Affairs to have travelled to Eritrea, which should be seen as a new attempt to establish dialogue on David Isaak's case and other important issues for and between our countries. As the first Swedish Minister for Foreign Affairs to have visited China in 11 years, I raised Gui Minhai's case, and we've also a direct dialogue with Iran concerning the detained Swedes who are still waiting to see their families again. For us, not speaking with others is not an option when it involves Swedish interests and the safety and security of Swedish citizens. We will not cease in our efforts. Mr. Speaker, international law, including the UN Charter, is a cornerstone of Sweden's foreign and security policy. A world in which the rule of might outweighs international law and superpowers do as they please is not the world order we wish to see. Sweden fully supports the independence and integrity of international courts, and we welcome the establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Human rights and freedoms must be defended. The equal value of every individual, regardless of gender, age, sexual orientation or religion, is a matter of freedom. Violations of religious freedom are an increasing problem globally. Freedom of religion and belief is therefore an integral component of Sweden's efforts for human rights around the world. Mr. Speaker, we do not know what awaits us on the other side of these times of upheaval, but we do know that we need to be prepared for a more brutal world. We need to remain steadfast in our values, but also navigate pragmatically based on what is in Sweden's best interests. Security and law and order internationally, especially in our immediate vicinity in our neighbourhood, are essential in order for Swedes to feel safe and have belief in the future. The threat from the east and the signals from the west differ greatly in nature, and yet the answer is the same. We need to harness the strength of the Swedish economy, arm our defence, work even more closely together with our allies and partners. We must build global partnerships that make us more secure and economically stronger We must continue supporting Ukraine and never forget Lana and all the others fighting for their own future and for ours. Ultimately, it's a matter of safeguarding Sweden's peace, freedom and security. There is no more important task at hand.
På utrikesministerns anförande har Morgan
Johansson from the Socialdemokraterna, Håkan Svenneling, Vänsterpartiet, Kerstin Lundgren from the Centerparty and Jakob Risberg, Green Party have asked for a rejoinder. First, Morgan Johansson from the Social Democrats.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and the Foreign Minister for your statement there. I will say more about that in my address. But firstly, a rejoinder here with regard to the conflict in Israel and Palestine. Now, in the week, the Israeli government decided to declare the whole occupied West Bank as Israeli property, which is a huge step towards an annexation of the West Bank and a flagrant violation of international law and the Oslo Agreement. And we had a delegation from the Riksdag there, 5 of the 8 parties, and that was in the autumn. And there we were able to see that the Israeli settlers and their violence against civilian Palestinians, both Muslim and Christian Palestinians, has increased substantially in the last few years. And the Israeli settlers are really, these are terror organizations, I would say. They can just kill Palestinian farmers willy-nilly without any threat of sentencing or anything like that, any punishment. And this is something that we have heard a great deal about from human rights organizations. So we'll see that this is something that's going to increase further. And we've seen reactions from the EU, from the United Nations, that have condemned this decision, which is good. And I also saw that the Foreign Minister, that you condemned this decision, but for some reason you didn't take this eye to eye with Israeli representatives here in Sweden. Instead, this was just said on X, which is a bit peculiar, I would say, but that's not actually my question here. My question here is actual concrete measures with regard to war material and exports. Now, the Israeli government is suspected of really committing serious crimes against humanity during the war in Gaza. And still, Sweden exports war material to Israel, which has in fact increased fourfold in the last few years. So my question to the Foreign Minister is it really reasonable that a country that is suspected of serious crimes against war crimes and crimes against humanity can still purchase war material from Sweden? Foreign Minister, please, from the Moderate Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to Morgan Johansson for this question. The government considers the development in the West Bank as a very serious situation, and I addressed this in my statement. The continued expansion of settlements, the violence from settlers, and I've also received information that it is becoming even more challenging for Christians on the West Bank, and I addressed this myself with the Israeli Foreign Minister when I met him in Israel. Sweden condemns Israel's most recent decision to expand Israel's control of the West Bank. This undermines the two-state solution and makes the current peace efforts more complicated. Together with several countries, the government has condemned the further expansion of settlements on the West Bank that have been improved, including in the E1 area. And we encourage Israel to cancel that E1 plan. The government has been and remains clear in stating that the settlement policy and the settlements are in breach of international law, undermines the two-state solution and contributes to a raising of the conflict level. And you cannot hide anything if you publish it on X, as far as I'm concerned, because it spreads widely indeed. As for exports of military equipment, and I believe that Morgan Johansson is familiar with the fact that no new permits have or licenses have been issued after the 10th of October 2023. ISP, who are in charge of the licensing and permits, of course, and we have a very clear stance on Israel Palestinian experts, and this is a follow-up delivery of material which was not classified as war and military equipment at the time. So my question to retort to Morgan Johansson is that I hear a lot about Israel's responsibility from the left parties, but I hear very little about what you'd like to do about Hamas. I'd like to find out more about that. Thank you very much.
Tack. Morgan Johansson.
Morgan Johansson.
So not a role in the future running of Gaza. We're not talking about Gaza, we're talking about the West Bank and the increased violence against ordinary civilian Palestinians, which is ongoing day after day. And listening to the foreign minister now, I mean, no concrete measures at all. There. I mean, words are not enough, and condemnation is not enough. You actually have to do something concrete, tangible. And we, for example, think that we need to pause the association agreement between and stop these settlers from actually entering Palestinian land. And you're saying also about stopping the export of munitions to Israel. And that is not enough. It's not enough just to speak about this. Words are not. We actually need to put words into practice, because otherwise the signals to the rest of the world would be that there are double standards here, that some countries can just behave any way they like, whereas other countries cannot. And this, of course, undermines the respect for international law. And international law, we are, responsible for trying to uphold international law. Final rejoinder from the Foreign Minister, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My apologies. I assumed that Morgan Johansson was listening to my statement earlier, but I was very clear in saying that we want to have sanctions against extremist settlers and against Israeli ministers who are promoting such settlements. It's very concrete in its proposal, and we're going to work to get the necessary support in EU. The war in Gaza is one of the foreign policy issues which have raised most emotions in Sweden. I think it's impossible to see this in isolation from what's happening in the West Bank either. It's no surprise that it is an emotional, that over 1,200 people died in the Hamas horrific attacks, and we still see the enormous human suffering. And I understand that from the left parties there's an interest to use this conflict in the domestic policy debate, but I will not choose that path. I will maintain my focus where it should be, a reduced suffering and bringing pressure to bear on Israel and on Hamas to stick to the peace agreement. Thank you very much. That concludes this round of rejoinders. Håkan Svenneling of the Left Party is next for his rejoinder.
Herr talman,
Mr. Speaker, when the foreign minister read the statement on foreign policy last year, she said, let me quote, Sweden's and the United States bilateral relations are very good, end of quote. And then we had a statement which mentioned most things apart from the President of the United States, Donald Trump. Now, 1 year later, the situation is more crystal clear. Donald Trump is a dangerous president because he violates international law, a dangerous president because he threatens other countries, a dangerous president because he undermines the United Nations and is trying to create its own body where he will always have the final say. In addition to that, a trade war with it all and everyone, and the result is just higher prices, higher costs. The foreign minister's statement here, we heard, the last year replaced the lack of mentioning of the United States last year to mentioning very little and saying there's no strategy here. And for a number of years we've heard the message about a strong transatlantic link, but now this link appears to be weak, even broken. The United States' new national security strategy is instead pointing at Europe as a threat, and Trump's threats against Denmark and Greenland are not just signals from the West. They are showing us and demonstrating us something quite different to a functioning link. Foreign Minister, what are you prepared to do about this? The Foreign Minister, please.
Talman,
Till skillnad från vänsterpartierna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As opposed to the left parties, my focus as Minister for Foreign Affairs, I want to safeguard Sweden's security, respecting international law. That's part of the Swedish foreign policy interest. I've been very clear on that matter when it's been clear that the US actions have been in breach of international law, such as in Venezuela, or when the US administration has been threatening in its rhetorics against Greenland and Denmark. We note that we see a US administration that is action unpredictably and sometimes with a message that is something which is divisive to Europe and Europe's unity. I will continue to be clear whenever the US administration's actions are in danger of damaging Sweden's or the EU's interest, but I'm not going to speak in emotions and upheaval just because Mr. Svenneling would like me to do so. I have an absolute obligation to take Sweden's interest as a priority, and the relationship with the US remains important regardless of which administration is in power. And it is a good at the corporate level, for example, as opposed to the Social Democrats. The government did not choose a side in the US presidential election. The US is crucial to Sweden's and the EU's security, and the US is Sweden's second largest export market. And this is why we continue to safeguard the transatlantic link and the breadth of interactions between Sweden and the US, going way beyond just contacts and dealings with the US administration. Moving forward, we clearly need a stronger EU, taking more of the responsibility for our own security, our competitiveness and our future. That is what Sweden has seen. This is how we act. But the path to that point is not by dividing, but rather than joining forces, pooling resources, not least the countries around the Baltics, that the left parties ignored entirely when they were in government. So I have a question for Håkan Svenneling. Why would Håkan Svenneling not wish to build closer ties with the Mercosur countries?
Herr talman, jag tänkte göra något ganska...
Now I'm going to do something a bit unusual, which is actually to give the foreign minister a present. It's a book. It's not some left-winger like myself who's written it. This is, in fact, Daniel Immer, the Danish researcher, How to Hide an Empire, that book, which is about the imperialistic policies or politics of the United States to expand its territory. Now, this was published a couple of years ago, but it really shows how the imperialist expansion has been a red thread throughout the 250 years of the United States history. And at the same time, as many measures have been taken to hide and conceal this fact, which is important today when Donald Trump is raging over Bad Bunny singing at the Super Bowl. This is because Bad Bunny is from Puerto Rico. This is a territory, not a state, a federal state. So it goes back to the Monroe Doctrine in his national strategy. This is a way of taking us back to not the previous century, but the one before that when it comes to American imperialist policies. Final rejoinder from the Foreign Minister, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the gift. The government did what we said we would do. We got into NATO, we increased our support to Ukraine, and we strengthened the security policy cooperation in our immediate vicinity. All this is because our focus is on Sweden's and Europe's security. This is in strong contrast to the left party and large parts of which constitutes a large part of the Social Democrats' possibility of government. They want us to revoke the DCA agreement when the world really needs to cooperate between like-minded powers. This government has done that. I note that I have not received any answer in that section. Thank you. Thank you. That exchange of rejoinders is finished. Kerstin Lund, Centerparty, go ahead.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Foreign Minister for the statement of foreign policy, where we can agree on quite a lot, in fact. As an example, support to Ukraine. We would like to see more of that, perhaps more than the government. We put pressure on them on that. But also as regards pressure on Russia, there's more remains to be done. And of course, support to Denmark and Greenland and Sweden's position there as well. And David, Isaac Mediasa Jalala and Gui Minhai must also be released. And this is an important view from this chamber and also from the Centre Party. However, I would have wished the Democratic man Jimmy Lai was mentioned, who has just been sentenced in Hong Kong. One of the people who is standing up to the Communist Party's rules in China and regulations. Journalists and political prisoners we can see in many different countries, not least in China. Foreign policy is about choosing, yes, absolutely. But it's unfortunate that the government has chosen to see the global south as relatively uninteresting, as it were, and going back to our immediate proximity and leaving Africa, as it were, which will in fact be important if we're going to create a new world order. And Mr. Speaker, the climate, the Arctic, security, it's all very clear to me. And here the government, they see this more as a point of action in their relations with China. It doesn't quite feel perhaps the most natural partner when we are discussing that matter. So my question, therefore, is the government, what is the government's view on climate and security? Thank you. Foreign Minister, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That was somewhat of an expose. I didn't really know where the member wanted to land this, but if we talk about Jim and Lai and a number of Swedish citizens, of course, naturally, the situation for rights in China is very serious, which I also brought up with my Chinese colleague during my trip to Peking last autumn. And the sentence for Jim Lai and his co-defendants being determined now. Sweden and other countries have made statements about that, condemning it and supporting their freedom, as well as other European countries that were present at the trial. So this is not about being popular. It's very important to talk about, though. It's very important for this government. We are concerned about the developments in Africa. Sweden has been involved in many ways to build stronger contacts to African countries. And together with other Nordic ministers, we were there recently in Zimbabwe to talk to the African Union. And there were not many countries that have the ability to make such strong contacts. I've also been in South America to meet our colleagues there. We need to make stronger bonds with them as well. And it's unfortunate with the left-wing coalition, as we see, not wanting to make these contacts where we need them. As far as China as well, I said very clearly, there are areas where we can cooperate, but there are areas where we are very careful. But I was not mostly talking about climate there. I was just mentioning that briefly. But one of the greatest givers of climate aid is us. And we need to work with the global south to reduce climate emissions. This is a very important question for the government. Thank you. The Centre Party, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I can agree that when the Foreign Minister just touch upon the climate very briefly, but that's not really a sign of it being a priority. And it's very clear that the climate is a security policy issue, a very vital one, in fact. And if you are then working with Swedish security at the global level, then climate matters are, in fact, central, which should be prioritized. Support to the Green Fund is great and all well and good, but it's not sufficient. And you need to have a climate political agenda or climate policy agenda, which you haven't put forward. And then may I make a comment as well with regard to the Mercosur agreement. The Centre Party is, of course, in favour of free trade. It's very important. It's good that we have concluded this agreement. So please don't mix apples and pears. Thank you. Dear Foreign Minister, keep order, actually, when it comes to these matters. Final rejoinder from the Foreign Minister, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have a very clear climate agenda, and we see what many do not see, that is the that the question is global. And therefore, it is very important. If you really think that the climate threat is real, then the most important thing needs to be to reduce emissions as much as you possibly can for each invested crown. And that's where Sweden is one of the greatest international donors of climate transition financing. So it is very important in our budget negotiation, as it was for the Centre Party recently, to get a electric bike premium through. I also want to say that it is important to think that you risk hitting the wall because you are needing to cooperate with the left party on the left side if you support the left after the election. Thank you. There, with that exchange of rejoinders was finished. The Environmental Party, Jakob Riesberg, has the floor. Go ahead.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, the statement for foreign policy has a clear pattern, as it were. You can see the principles and the looking and see what's happening around the world. We can see that we read in the press a lack of analysis is great, which means that trying to understand what Sweden actually wants to achieve with its foreign policy and why becomes impossible. But the parts of the puzzle are included in the statement without the Foreign Minister actually being able to make a puzzle of them, as it were. The Foreign Minister says the world where what might goes before right and international law is not the world order that we wish to see. And mentions China and enabling Russia's war against Ukraine and the total lack or not using the word diplomacy in her address. She draws the conclusion that we, together with like-minded states, for example, in Africa, who are in favour of having common rules, etc., we can be a force to be reckoned with, which is very good. Referring to Liberia, where Sweden has close relationships with Swedish companies back in the 60s and 70s, mined in the biggest iron mine there, one of the poorest countries, but was able to elect the first female president, in fact, head of state. It's a country which has, clearer than any other country in Africa, supports Ukraine, and since the 1st of January is, in fact, a member of the Security Council. Liberia is the equal-minded country in Africa that we can become allies with, and that we also, from a Swedish security perspective, should make the most of our relationships to put pressure on Russia. As member of the Security Council, Liberia has everything that the minister wishes to see. What does the government do? Well, they end the bilateral support to Liberia and also the peace work that's conducted there, and also close the embassy, Swedish embassy in the country. I don't understand the logic in this, and I do hope that the foreign minister can clarify this, if they thought at all about this. Thank you. The foreign minister, please.
Tack så mycket.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Several African countries today are among the world's fastest growing economies at the same time as they're competing for influence in Africa. And this naturally has large consequences for Sweden and Europe. We have a joint interest in, together with African states, facilitating trade, promoting peace and security, and maintaining international law, not the least. Therefore, we do need to develop our relationships with international African partners, such as Nigeria, the largest country in Africa by demography. We opened a new mission in Lagos. We have been concentrating on French-speaking West Africa, and we are a strong point for our communication with the region in the Horn of Africa, as well as in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. Sweden has a strong brand in Africa and a good foundation to build relationships on. We notice this now, especially when we, to a greater degree, are moving forward from relations based on aid to relations based on trade. That's a development that this government really welcomes. And we have a broad presence in embassies and broad cooperation with African countries. Clearly, we are leading the work in the Great Lakes region with international trade. We are working with trade instead of aid. And in our aid policy, we have had to prioritize. We are prioritizing Ukraine. That is our foremost foreign policy priority. We have been forced to reprioritize resources from Liberia, as I've said. Our relationship with Liberia is more important than ever. Thank you. Green Party.
Skifta fokus och börja.
I'll do shift focus and speak about something which is not in the safety, using the word occupation, but bearing in mind your response here, Foreign Minister. Let me remain on this issue that we spoke of, that I mentioned. You said that we have stronger relationships than ever, a stronger relationship than ever with Liberia, but you closed the embassy there. I don't understand the logic here. Since the 1st of January, Liberia is a member of the United Nations Security Council. We've got a good relationship, not just as regards development aid. We have emptied this country of resources. We have enriched ourselves on this country, and now they're a member of the Security Council. They voted against the United States for the first time for a very long time in the General Assembly last year when it was a resolution against Russia for Ukraine. They voted against that together with the EU member states. So that's a strong ally, even if it's a financially weak country. And you choose to close the embassy there. I just do not understand the logic. Final rejoinder from the Foreign Minister, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much, Jakob Riesberg, for having mentioned the Security Council, where Sweden has been, to support Liberia in this particular issue. This is something we discussed in my conversation with the Foreign Minister. Jakob Riesberg here has dropped some words that he says are missing, or he does not see in the foreign policy declaration, for example, the word diplomacy. And I think this is something that is revealing, because it speaks to all Swedish citizens have been imprisoned around the world. That work to free them has been conducted through diplomacy, but we don't need to look for words because we are looking for results. It's the same thing about the nagging about feministic foreign policy. We've led UN Women. We have really put that on the agenda. We've worked for women and girls around the world. Thank you. Thank you. That exchange of rejoinders was finished. Back to the speakers list. Morgan Johansson has the floor. Go ahead, Social Democrats.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me once again begin by thanking the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the government statement of foreign policy. These are very dramatic times, very unpredictable times with rapid changes. It is vital that a country such as ours is able to understand what is happening correctly and able to draw the correct conclusions. We can agree with the government on a great deal as regards, for example, our view of Russia as the biggest security policy threat for the foreseeable future, as regards how we should act within NATO to reinforce our defence capability in our immediate area, as regards the continued support to Ukraine. However, as regards the assessment of developments in the United States and how that should be managed, it is very clear that this year our assessment differs compared to that of the government's. The government has acted indecisively, has not really been able to get its bearings in this new environment and with the behaviour and the new policy of the United States. We saw this already last year when Trump threatened Denmark and Greenland for the first time. We, the Social Democrats, said that it was unacceptable and that Europe must respond sharply. The Foreign Minister then commented this by criticising not Trump for his threats, but us because we had opposed him. The Foreign Minister said that it was extremely irresponsible of the Social Democrats to have done that. But if we have learned anything from this year, it is that you cannot flatter or appease Trump. It doesn't get you anywhere. Things just get worse. He and his government need to be responded to clearly, forcefully, providing a united front. This is what Denmark and Europe did this year when Trump threatened with tariffs. The Danish PM Mette Frederiksen and Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen put their foot down. Europe had their backs. It was clear and forceful. If you do it in that way, then he is forced to back down, and it's the most important lesson that we can learn from this year. So we see that they've sharpened their tongue about the US in the statement, which is good. And it is true, though, that Marco Rubio's tone at this year's Munich conference was not quite as aggressive as J.D. Vance's speech last year. However, the contents of the speech was the same. Europe is bad and weak. Europe has destroyed itself by investing in welfare and free trade. The climate crisis is a figment of people's imagination. The US will not be complying with any international laws or respect international law. The rules-based world order has played out its role. That was also Rubio's message this year. And behind the scenes, the United States pressurized Ukraine to get them to give up territory to Russia and to get them to have elections in the middle of a war. The United States claims on Greenland remain, but not only that, the whole of the Western Hemisphere is to be part of the US's sphere of interest, regardless of what the people in those countries think. And then, after his speech, Rubio went to Budapest to meet Viktor Orban, the most authoritarian leader in Europe, and support for Putin in the EU. So how was Marco Rubio's speech received? Well, apparently standing ovation by many, and the foreign minister said afterwards that she was relieved. But the truth of the matter is that Rubio said exactly the same thing that Vance did, but not quite as aggressively. So, Mr. Speaker, I don't think we should fall for this good cop, bad cop strategy. There's no reason to feel relieved. Europe's reaction cannot be flattery and standing ovations. The European reaction must be to continue to support the transatlantic link and cooperation with the United States, yes, but also to understand that we really need to drastically decrease our strategic dependence on the United States, our military, technological and financial dependence. Instead, we need to expand our cooperation with other countries, other regions. Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has taken initiative to establish new, broad global alliances for small and medium-sized countries, and Sweden needs to get in there. Canada, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, but also Latin America, Africa, India, and the rest of the global south. This was the conclusion of the Social Democrats already a year ago. That is why we requested that the Defence Commission be reconvened in order to make an up-to-date security policy analysis. Now, first the government dismissed this, but at the end of the day, they did take us up on it, and now a new Defence Commission has been established since a couple of weeks ago. And we are grateful for that, even if we have lost a year, but it was necessary, and we do look forward to constructive discussions where we will hopefully be able to finally find common ground for how to interpret the difficult current world situation and how to react to it. Mr. Speaker, Sweden must be a strong voice in favour of international law as well as human rights. For the Palestinians' right to their own state, for the Iranian people's self-evident right to freedom from the brutal oppression of the mullahs and the right to determine their own future, for the people of Western Sahara and their right to independence and self-determination, and yes, wherever in the world these values are under threat, Sweden's voice shall be strong and clear. In addition, as regards nuclear power control, especially when agreements have expired, we need to deter a nuclear war as far as we can. Unfortunately, the most common comment about Sweden in international context is, where is Sweden? Where has Sweden got to? And you can understand that because Sweden is that the picture is that Sweden has withdrawn itself more and more from the international stage. We no longer participate at the ministerial level at important meetings such as the climate summit in the autumn or the meeting on development financing for the poorest countries last summer. The foreign minister is absent from every third EU foreign minister meeting in the EU and is closing embassies in Bolivia, Liberia, Zimbabwe, phasing out aid to these countries as well. And development aid is coming to an end in Tanzania, Mozambique, Mali, South Sudan, Burkina Faso, Cambodia, Iraq, as well as Afghanistan. Sweden and other Western countries have withdrawn aid. Then, of course, there's room for other players like Russia and China to enter the situation. And also, we've withdrawn our support to UN bodies that we have previously supported, the World Food Programme, the UNFPA, UNDP, UN Women, UNRWA. So again, we are weakening the UN, and nor are we leaders, not even by example anymore. Sweden used to be a country with a low level of unemployment, high growth, small number of poor people. Today we have 500,000 unemployed people. Growth is at the bottom of the EU tables, and 700,000 live below the poverty level, a twofold increase in the last 3 years. Sweden used to be a leader in the climate transition. Today emissions are increasing here, and Sweden will fail to achieve a single climate goal. We are throwing away our rubbish to our neighbour's garden. Sweden used to be a country that stood up for the rights of women and girls. Today, the feminist foreign policy has been discarded, and the cuts in development aid are something that could affect women and girls badly in, for example, countries in Africa and also, as well as Afghanistan. Sweden's development aid used to be 1% of our GDP. Today, we are quickly reaching a shameful 0.7%. Mr. Speaker, just to end, our vision is that Sweden should be a good citizen in the international community, a good citizen, a role model for others, takes responsibility for itself and what we share, an active, global, not passive member, a citizen which shows initiative and leadership, and sometimes is at the fore, aware of the fact that if you don't dare to be first, then often you are last in line. So Sweden needs to be a good citizen in the international community, but there we need to redefine our foreign policy. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Tack på Morgan Johanssons.
The following have requested a rejoinder: Aron Emerson, and the Foreign Minister, Kerstin Lundgren from the Centre Party, Magnus Berntsson from the Christian Democrats, and Fredrik Malm from the Liberals, please. First, we have Aron Emerson from the Sweden Democrats, please.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Social Democrats are usually connected with two things: putting their finger up in the air to determine where the winds are blowing, what direction, to determine what's most popular and what could bring the red-green parties back into power, even if they were only a few moments ago of the adverse opinion. And secondly, to act more actively to try and accept the idea that the map has to be adapted to the terrain. We've seen the lack of policy for what Sweden should do within NATO now that we're finally in NATO, lack of information on what's happening in anti-personnel mines, and the presence in Finland. There's no agreement to the left, basically, very shortly before the general elections. How do the Social Democrats and Morgan Johansson intend to get everyone in their team to row in the same direction when they're all holding one oar each and one compass, where one says no to an agreement for DCA, for example, and the other says, one says yes, one says no, in favour or against NATO membership, like we saw previously? The only thing that appears to unite you is the agreement on not wanting to work together amongst yourselves. So my brief and important question is this: which line can we expect, which policy can we expect with a green and red government if, against all odds, you would win the election? Morgan Johansson, Social Democrats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, we've just said that Sweden should be a good citizen in the international community, a country that takes responsibility for itself and others. And then, of course, then it's not good enough to have a climate policy which entails that we, in fact, contribute to the problem rather than we try to resolve it. Nor is it good enough that our country withdraws from important development aid, for example, contributions in countries that need that support more than ever. As regards defence policy, there we are in agreement between our parties on how we want to develop a defence policy. We have, in fact, come to an agreement broadly where Sweden Democrats are part of, where we want to increase defence expenditure. And we've also said how important it is to have new defence capabilities and that we can bind our part of the world together, and the defence organisation in the Nordic countries, in the Baltic states, Germany, Poland having joint defence. And that's just one of many examples, and we are completely in agreement on my side. But the Sweden Democrats, what about you on the other side? Jimmy Åkesson on television the other day saying, supporting Trump. He wants Trump to enter into the election campaign and back the Sweden Democrats in the next election campaign. And my question, therefore, is, if the right wing side win the election, as it were, and Sweden Democrats are part of the government. So what line are you going to support in the Ukraine issue, for example, the matter of the Ukraine? If you want Trump to support you, do you think that that's for free if you get that support at all? So yes, okay, there might be certain differences of opinion on my side of the divide, but I think that you could ask or answer questions yourself on this. What policy will a Sweden Democrat-led government have if they are in power? Thank you. A rejoinder from the Sweden Democrats, please.
Morgan Johansson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I note that Morgan Johansson is avoiding the two very crucial security policy issues where there's disagreement to the left and talk about all other issues. That's precisely where we are looking for the answer we need to have. What approach can we expect from a government to the left? We're not getting any answers. And returning to what characterizes the Social Democrats is the fact that they want to be ahead of the orchestra for some sort of a symphonic orchestra, but they're lacking the music sheets. They don't have a repertoire. They don't have a second violin. When in relation to the feminist foreign policy having been abandoned, what do the Social Democrats wish to fill such a potential feminist foreign policy with this government and in cooperation with the Sweden Democrats? We're very much focused on results with effective gender equality work globally. Do the Social Democrats wish to return to a policy where you have writing study circles to writing articles on Wikipedia and other such measures, or invitees that are 50-50 of each gender? What do you wish to fill this policy with? Final rejoinder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a very arrogant tone taken by the Sweden Democrats when it comes to women's rights. Just as the foreign minister said a moment ago, the feminist foreign minister is just rubbish. No, it's not actually. Feminist foreign policy have been about highlighting the rights of women and girls and them being represented in all contexts. And I think it's more important than ever in a situation where women and girls are struggling in Iran, for example, to get rid of the oppression when they're struggling in Afghanistan there as well, and the oppression there as well. And even in Western countries, they are struggling for rights which have been taken for granted previously. For example, the right to abortion. It is more important than ever, actually, that Sweden stands up for that. So don't just talk about, having study circles, etc. Look at the evaluations that have been made instead. Expert groups for development aid analysis, where it's been very clear that the feminist foreign policy did actually have important impact on the development aid side. And this is something that we will reintroduce. Thank you very much. Thank you. That's the end of that round of rejoinders. Next, we have the Foreign Minister, please.
Herr talman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We really are entering into the run-up to the elections. There's a lot in the speech by Morgan Johansson to do with what he disagrees with in the government policy. But just like my colleague, I heard very little about what the Social Democrats would like to do themselves. And that's no major surprise. Morgan Johansson is the Social Democrats' foreign minister candidate, potentially. And that's no easy task to get everyone to the left to agree on foreign policy and security policy, because the Green Party and the Left Party are disagreeing with the Mercosur-EU agreement. Half of the so-called support parties for a government to the left say no to Sweden joining NATO. The TCA agreement with the US is something that the Green Party would like to cancel. Sweden needs a foreign and security policy which strengthens our cooperation with our friends and neighbours, not neglecting them. To strengthen Sweden's and Europe's economy and defence, not tying our hands behind our back and making us weaker. We agree on that on our side of the political dividing line. Sweden cannot afford more turns back and forth when it comes to trade agreements and cooperation to make Sweden stronger. I have 3 questions to Morgan Johansson. First, how does he intend to put a team together which wants to make Sweden not be more insecure and poor? Morgan Johansson ever speak to any of those who've been so grateful to us for our support? And we've calibrated our message with what was asked for. And thirdly, what taxes does Morgan Johansson intend to raise for ordinary, hardworking people to fund this highly expansive donor policy which is promoted? Thank you.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, all I can say is as regards defence policy, we are in agreement, not just between ourselves, but actually all 8 parties, I would say, when it comes, bearing in mind the agreement within the Defence Commission last year. So I don't quite understand what the Foreign Minister is, what she means by saying making our country less secure. We're all in agreement from right to left. The increase in our expenditure on defence, we're in agreement on that strategy there to bind, as I said earlier, the countries in our vicinity together so that we can cooperate more deeply on defence, so that it becomes more or less seamless between the Nordic countries, the Baltics and Poland and Germany, so that we can defend ourselves. Where we don't agree, I think, is the funding and the financing of this. We want to have a tax, a preparedness tax, which might finance the huge expenditure on defence that we see coming. Why? Well, because we don't want all this to be paid by future generations, our children and grandchildren to have to pay for this, nor do we want this to mean that we can't invest in, for example, important areas like healthcare, etc. Now, the government has said no to that. So defence is not that important for the moderate party, that the richest should be prepared to pay, 1,000 krona here or there. No, somebody else should pay at some stage in the future. That's what they think. So yes, we are saying yes, we need to increase tax for those who have the highest income, the very highest. So in order to get back some of the money that you have already spent. Now, the Foreign Minister and her colleagues themselves, they received 6,000 kronor more after the tax decrease during this term of office, instead of investing that money in important welfare areas or, for example, as a part financing of the defence expenditure. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Foreign Minister, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to Morgan Johansson for being very clear in saying that it's going to be very, very expensive indeed for hardworking citizens if the Social Democrats take over. We have other priorities in our government, and we've done what we set out to do. We've brought Sweden into NATO. We've increased the support for Ukraine. We have more collaboration in the neighbourhood for our cooperation. Nothing is more important to this government than the security of Sweden and the Swedes. That was not the case under the previous government. The S-led government barely travelled to the Baltic states. When Stefan Löfven and Magdalena Andersson were prime ministers, they only visited once in the years 2014 to 18, and not a single one in the period 2018 to 22. To gather votes to their own UN campaign was more important than to have strong security in the vicinity. Tahiti more important than other countries much closer. Are you prepared, is Morgan Johansson prepared to reprioritize for what's truly important? Final rejoinder.
I don't think that a foreign minister should tell off other people, or other members of parliament about being not travelling, etc., despite the fact that she only attends every third foreign minister meeting in Brussels. So despite the fact saying that Europe is our most important foreign policy platform, so perhaps she should pipe down. Now, as regards what we've seen actually in this government is that they haven't at all looked at the financing at all of the defence expenditure. In fact, they just decided to say that the future generation will have to pay. We've got the lowest growth level. I mean, we're at the bottom of the EU table. So, and of course, there is no more money there to be had. So Elizabeth Svantesson, the Minister of Finance, has emptied the coffers, not just for this term of office, but also the next term of office, she says, that there's no money left at all. And then we say that if we are going to be able to turn things around, we need to be prepared to ensure that those who have that absolutely highest level of income, that they pay a bit more. And I think, in fact, the Swedish people are in favour of that. Thank you. That's the end of that round of rejoinders. Next, we have Kerstin Lundgren from the Centre Party, please.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Morgan Johansson, for the speech. I didn't hear in his speech anything about the climate as a matter of security. To the Centre Party, it is very clear that we have identified the climate as a security challenge which cannot be resolved by military means primarily, but may require this at a later stage, because we know that climate issues lead to and will lead to conflict in the future. So I'd like to hear from the Social Democrats of their view of the climate issue in terms of a security risk to be dealt with. And secondly, China. I didn't hear China mentioned, and I'm curious if the Social Democrats see that the time for one China, two systems as an approach is something of the past, considering what we've seen in China's development, and how you can tell that Hong Kong, who was a part of the other system, is more becoming a carbon copy of the party in Beijing. And finally, Orban's Hungary has taken the EU hostage on way too many issues. We've got stuck. It's been tricky when it comes to, and sluggish when it comes to sanctions against Russia, for example. Would Morgan Johansson and the Social Democrats be prepared to introduce sanctions at a Swedish level just to get out of Orban's kidnapping, and his clause? Those are my three questions. Thank you. Morgan Johansson, you have the floor.
Tack.
Thank you very much. I think you're saying sanctions not against Hungary, but perhaps Israel and other countries. I think you meant in your last question there. And I would like to look into that. In fact, I know that there are other countries in the EU, in fact, that do that. And I also know that there are things that we can do. For example, stopping the settlers and the goods from actually entering Swedish territory, and the EU Commission have actually said that they're not included in the trade agreement, which is why you have nationally a possibility to introduce a law to stop those products. That's a national sanction that I think would be a good idea already at this stage. Now, the climate. I did mention the climate, actually. I did say that Sweden used to be a role model when it comes to the climate transition. We don't anymore. We're going to fail to achieve every single goal. We're increasing our emissions. And it feels as if, and I did say that we're throwing away our rubbish, in the neighbour's garden. They have to look after our rubbish, as it were. So instead of showing the world that you can actually resolve these problems, we're again, leaving it to future generations. And naturally, the climate is an important climate security issue, because when climate changes, leading to, for example, natural disasters, flooding, extreme storms and weather, etc., and an increased poverty, then of course conflict increase between people. So naturally there is a very clear security policy aspect. China, I think that we should maintain the policy that we've had before, but just as the European Commission has expressed it, we need to, it's decoupling but de-risking. We need to look at China as an important trade partner. However, we also need to be aware of the fact that there are goods and services that perhaps we should not purchase from China, and then there needs to be a caution there with regard to China. That's our view. Thank you. Kerstin Lundgren from the Centre Party, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for those answers. When it comes to China, it's important that we are clear in saying that the dual model system, which came in the wake of the handover of Hong Kong from British rule to China, that's when this model was created. However, it's no longer functional. There is only one China policy, to do with meeting the Communist Party, China, and the very strong grip they have of their entire area. It's very important to give support to Taiwan and to note the fact that there's no longer a dual model system. Final rejoinder.
Thank you. I'll continue on China then. It's also self-evident that in all contexts we need to highlight violations of human rights, and we also must criticise in all contexts this development that we see where superpowers try to create their spheres of interest, as it were, that they should dominate their part of the world. Like the American behaviour now as regards the Western Hemisphere, it's also serious because it sends a signal to other superpowers that they can behave in exactly the same way. So we need to safeguard the freedoms of all people and their possibility to self-determination, and that applies to all countries across the world. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's the end of that round of rejoinders. Next, we have Magnus Berntsson from the Christian Democrats, please.
Herr talman, under den socialdemokratiska...
Mr. Speaker, during the Social Democratic time in government, there was often talk about different tracks of dialogue and diplomatic openings towards Iran, while at the same time we've seen how the regime in Iran continues to fund Hezbollah, Hamas, and others, and brutally attacking their own people and planning to support security threats in Europe by funding them. We know more today. We know that Iran is not only destabilizing the Middle East, but actively also attempting to impact and threat European societies. More recently, we've also seen regime-loyal flags at Palestine protests, raising issues of how attempts are made to include their supporters here in Sweden as well. So here's my question to Morgan Johansson. Is he of the opinion that the previous line presented by the Social Democrats was sharp enough, and if the Social Democrats would be prepared now to work for much more stringent and consistent EU sanctions against Iran for support of terror-labeled proxy groups, and to have a more clear link recognized between the regime in Iran and concrete threats to our security identified in Europe. Thank you. Morgan Johansson?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just as I said in my address, the mullah's regime in Iran for decades have been a huge problem, not just for the people in Iran who have had to live in this awful, terrible oppression. However, we've also seen this, also we've seen this where tens of thousands of people have been killed more recently. However, I do welcome every development heading in a democratic direction and support for human rights in Iran. And I would say that we need to do everything that we can in the world around Iran to increase pressure on Iran, which is why a couple of years ago we, for example, agreed on putting pressure to put the Revolutionary Guard Corps on the terror list. And we were in agreement on that, but this is a reality now after a few years. And it's been a success, I would say, because it does reduce the possibility of them to recruit to the Revolutionary Guard Corps, but it also has an impact on Europe, for example. And the Social Democrats, we will do everything that we can to increase the pressure on the Iranian regime to ensure that we can see something else happen there, and that once and for all that we can get rid of this regime, this awful oppression that has suffocated people for decades now. Thank you. Thank you. Magnus Berntsson from the Christian Democrats, please, for the second rejoinder.
Thank you to MP Johansson for giving more detail on in his reply. There was a lot of focus on the US initially and very little on Iran. I thought it was a relevant question to ask. Therefore, many have seen the pictures from the time of the Social Democratic years in office with ministers in veils visiting Iran with a very subservient friendliness, considering that people were being being executed and tortured at the same time. So once again, I would like to ask Morgan Johansson of what it is that makes your statements credible now that you have a clearer line in relation to Iran than the one you represented before. What, in more concrete terms, has changed in your analysis, in your policies and your preparedness to bring pressure to bear on the regime? Thank you. Morgan Johansson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me just say that I know that there are photos sort of around about visits to Iran. At that, let me just say that then the assessment was that that type of visit might in fact lead to the release of a number of prisoners, which it actually did, actually. So in different contexts, you have to try to use the channels available to you to try to pursue change or, in the best case, to the release of prisoners of conscience. And that is the background to that visit and those photographs. And I don't think that you should reduce discussions to that level, that when you have diplomatic contacts with that aim in mind, that you then turn it around and say something about something else instead that it wasn't about. So now that I've clarified that, let me say that we are very clear on this. We want to increase pressure on Iran to ensure that we see more democratic developments there. Thank you. That's the end of that round of rejoinders. Next, we have Malmer from the Liberal Party, please.
Tack så mycket, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I read in media, and it was made clear here in some of the previous rejoinders as well, that the Social Democrats have chosen to enter into the general elections by reintroducing the feminist foreign policy, as it was called. I refer to myself as a feminist. My party is a feminist party, similarly. But what we saw of the so-called feminist foreign policy from the Social Democrats the last time around was an absolute unmitigated disaster. Just words, 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 and very little action. One clear action, however, was something that went viral, that was seen globally. It was back in 2017 when the Social Democratic ministers traveled to Tehran in Iran, and top politicians from the Social Democrats showed their humility to the mullahs. They paraded in front of them, they wore hijabs, they bent their backs in customary submission, and the government also signed 5 cooperation agreements with the Ayatollahs at that point. One on gender equality. Stefan Löfven, the Prime Minister, was asked by the newspaper Aftonbladet about this. The newspaper asked, how is this agreement going to help women in Iran? And Stefan Löfven answered, and I quote, that is for Iran to develop further. In what way, you might wonder? Why should Sweden, Mr. Speaker, give legitimacy to a woman-hating regime to decide themselves how to operate in the field of gender equality? Is it more of this, Morgan Johansson, that we can expect if the Social Democrats were to move back into and take over the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the autumn? That would be a horrific fate for women in the world. Morgan Johansson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But just as I just explained in the rejoinders with Magnus Berntsson, we haven't just supported the sanctions, but we've actually put pressure on other countries to increase them. We took the initiative, for example, a couple of years ago, that we would put the Revolutionary Guard Corps on the terror list. And together with the other parties, there was unanimity on this. And now we have, in fact, the Revolutionary Guard is, in fact, listed on the terror list. So, I mean, Malmer was just saying that the feminist foreign policy was a disaster. Well, has he read the expert group for development aid analysis and their assessment of the feminist foreign policy and how important it was when it comes to development aid, that in every single context highlight the situation and rights of women and girls, that in every single context highlight their rights in this way? Obviously not. because if he had, he wouldn't have expressed himself like that. But what we see now with Fredrik Malm is that we see a dramatic decrease of support to girls and women around the world. Let's just take a look at Afghanistan, where they have phased out all development aid, which has an impact on Save the Children, which has to end agreements with the local players and leave girls and women on their own to fight on their own in Afghanistan. That's what you support. Or Africa, where we're also withdrawing to a large extent in situations where people are suffering. The biggest humanitarian disaster at the moment right now, Sweden is withdrawing. So, if Fredrik Malm, you can produce a photo from 2007, and that is just some kind of rhetoric point there. But in practice, it's he who has dismantled support to women and girls across the world. And that, Mr. Speaker, we will change. Thank you. Thank you. Fredrik Malm from the Liberal Party, please.
Herr talman!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Fredrik Malm is a friend of big words. We hear from Morgan Johansson. These words, the ones who come with the fancy words, are Morgan Johansson and the Social Democrats, who are now stepping back to a feminist foreign policy. I am a feminist, but I do not believe that foreign policy is made feminist just because you state that that is the case. It's about your actions, what you do. And what does this government do? Well, we've allocated 90 billion Swedish kroner in military support to Ukraine, so Ukraine women won't have to be raped, occupied by a Russian fascistoid government and power which purports to represent traditional values. That's feminist policy in action. This government wants to give maximum support to Moldova and its woman president. That is feminist foreign policy. Through action, we build opportunities for women to strengthen their rights, not just through words. Final rejoinder, Morgan Johansson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we have been in agreement with regard to the support to Ukraine. Every single new package to Ukraine, we've been in agreement. I was responsible for some of the first package, for working with the first package, which was decided on already 4 days after the war of aggression started. So we've been in agreement. That's not where this conflict, what this conflict is about. This conflict is about the fact that Fredrik Malm's government have systematically decreased support to women and girls across the world. I mentioned Afghanistan. I mentioned also all those other countries, not least in Africa, where Sweden is withdrawing development aid. Go to the civil society organisations that have worked with these matters on site there locally, and ask them to tell you the situation, what they have to do now, Fredrik Malm, now that Sweden is withdrawing and leaving these local players on their own because they're not receiving any support from the Swedish government any longer. That is a part of the Swedish feminist foreign policy that we need to return to so that we can help these countries in these areas. Thank you.
Replikskiftet avslutat.
This is the end of this round of rejoinders. So let's go back to the speakers list. Aron Emerson from the Sweden Democrats next, please.
Herr talman!
Mr. Speaker, we live in the new age of disorder. Our continent is shook by large-scale wars and terror, old friends turning into new enemies. Red lines are replaced. We have red carpets, and old truths and shared rules are discarded, might before right. And there's very little to do in such a situation where the mist is settling over Europe, a time that used to be self-evident. Nothing can be taken for given. Security is no longer an abstract word. It's a policy document. It's a matter about transition of a society and survival. We live in a security policy environment which is not just serious but volatile. It's been clear that the world that we've got used to here has created a shift. A rules-based order has more and more turned towards one which is disorder with the breach of international rules, international law, moving into international lack of law.
Men nordiskt territorium är ingen fastighet.
The USA is an important part of it. Nordic territory is not a property market. With the present administration, Washington, and its actions in relation to our neighboring country, an uncomfortable insight has grown forth. We can no longer assume that USA is always the obvious stable ally it has been. When claims are made on Greenland, a Nordic territory, we see a paradigm shift, and paradigm shifts are not to be ignored. They are met by clear answers and effective actions with the intent to protect the Nordic countries and the future of the transatlantic link. Allied countries don't treat each other like potential prey. Greenland is not a strategic vacuum. It's a country with a people, a history, and a right to self-determination within the Danish kingdom. Understanding the island as a chessboard between great powers is exactly the rootless globalism that we conservatives are fighting against. Now, regardless of that, whether that political signaling is coming from Washington, Moscow, or Peking, but sharp rhetoric is not enough. Words have to be followed by actions. Europe, and in particular, the Nordic countries, should, together with Denmark and its allies, and its approval, establish increased presence around Greenland defensively, clearly. We need to meet this with meet Russia with a powerful and robust action in the Nordic countries and NATO. And the Arctic, Swedish Democrats have pointed out this out for a long time. This can and should occur, for example, through increased surveillance, maritime security, recurring joint Nordic and European exercises, increased civil military infrastructure, clear marking of sovereignty in accordance with international law, increased Nordic presence and joint investments. We have to, they don't respect borders. The West needs to jointly arm against the Axis powers in China and Russia and in the East. Mr. Speaker, at the same time, the war in Ukraine goes on. The front lines are not frozen. Are frozen, but this frozen is not the same thing as stable, and the soldiers are being hit by an ice cold wind. There are attacks from land, sea, from the air. The Russian air attacks have been intensified, and the threat does not stop at Ukraine's borders. Mr. Speaker, Russia is arming not just militarily, but rather in depth and systematically. They're building bases in our vicinity. They're adjusting their industry. They're mobilizing their people. School children are being indoctrinated. Criminals recruited. A whole society is being shaped for war. This is war. This is not a coincidence. It's a strategy. The Russian bears imperialistic march. Sweden's answer must be maintaining stubbornly and extensive support for Ukraine, militarily, humanitarily, politically. Just a couple of weeks ago, Sweden Democrats and the government presented a new support package for Ukraine of 1 billion crowns to support the energy sector. Energy is more than electricity. It's heat for a child that needs to sleep. It is light for a doctor who is doing their work. It's hope for families that refuse to give up, despite the facts that attacks are raining down. We are supporting Ukraine and its brave people with electricity plants, heat, spare parts. The support package in Sweden's support to Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion reaches 114 billion crowns, 24.4 in civilian support. The blue and yellow ties are historical and are becoming stronger and stronger for the future. We don't care about the SAR. Look at the starlings. Look at Iran now and North Korea. They're supporting Moscow. In Iran, brave people have been met by bullets. They've been killed by thousands and thousands. The world's pressure on the regime must increase, and these dictatorships must fall. In North Korea, the nuclear weapon program continues in the shadow of concern, of worry. That's a pattern. China is growing forth at the same time as a global power with the ability to project force far away from its immediate vicinity, and they have done so. They're arming massively. They're building a blue water fleet. They are expanding their nuclear weapon arsenal. They are supporting Russia and moving briskly towards a new world order based on power. And if that wasn't not enough, so for the first time since 1972, the world is without an agreement limiting strategic nuclear weapons. The New START treaty has expired. At this time, we need everything but naivety and wishful thinking. We need Nordic coolness and proactive and responsible manners of addressing things. There is a great need that the Swedish Democrats support to strengthen our nuclear dissuasion. Nuclear dissuasion. NATO is inferior to Russian as far as tactical nuclear weapons, both in quantity and quality. We need to support nuclear dissuasion. This has not been taken seriously enough over time. As recently as 2022, the Social Democrats proposed that Sweden should declare limits in our NATO membership to nuclear weapons. On the contrary to this passive manner of action, the Sweden Democrats actively seek to support nuclear deterrence, and we need to realize that even in peace time or a gray zone between peace and war, nuclear weapons should be able to be based on Swedish territory if so is needed. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we in our democracies are living under an existential threat. Taiwan is under constant threat from China. Supporting Taiwan is morally right, but also strategically wise. They have cutting-edge technology, innovation, and competence that can contribute to bilateral development and the ability to defense. This is not a time for doubt, not a time to be slow, not a time for symbolic politics. When future generations look at our time, they need to be able to say they did not stray, they did not close their eyes, they took their responsibility. Sweden needs to stand strong. Thank you. Thank you, Arne Jorgensen's speech. Håkan Svenneling, Kirsten Lindgren, Magnus Berngson, Jakob Risberg, and Fredrik Malmer asked for rejoinders. First, Morgan, the Sweden Democrats, go ahead.
For the Social Democrats. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thought I'd follow up the debate we had previously about the Sweden Democrats and Trump. We've seen quite a number of examples over the years how Sweden, you first supported Russia. You had Mikael Jansson, who was on the Defense Committee spreading a Russian narrative. You had Roger Fischtorff at one point, a spokesperson with links to Russian interests. And last week it turned out that you were top name in Jimmy Åkesson's home municipality, Sölvesborg, and Pitt Hammer has the same type of sympathies, and her blog posts is like diving into some strange upside down underworld. And there have been promotions of Trump, SD, the Sweden Democrats being Trump's party in Sweden, with contacts with the MAGA movement and contacts that have been reported on very enthusiastically. Tobias Andersson, Josef Fransson has been there. And you're also a party which has nominated Donald Trump to the Nobel Peace Prize, not once but twice. On one occasion, it was Matthias Carlsson, and he said the following when he nominated Trump, that no honest evaluator can deny the enormous contributions Trump has made for to a more peaceful world. A president who's renamed his defense ministry to the Ministry of War. there's something which doesn't tally here. First, you grow the contacts with the Russians, and then Russia invade Ukraine, and you realize that this was perhaps not such a good idea, and then you renew your contacts with Trump and MAGA, and then there's a threat to Greenland and Denmark, and you suddenly realize that that wasn't particularly good, and now you're trying to sort of get out of that situation. And here's my one question to you. I watched Jimmy Åkesson on television the other week, and he said that he would be happy to get support from Trump in the coming general election. That was after Trump threatened Greenland and Denmark. So here's my question. How should we interpret that? Have you broken off with the MAGA movement or not? Thank you. Arne Emilsson from the Sweden Democrats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, sometimes it's a little surprising to hear Morgan Johansson, both here in this chamber and in the media, speaking about these different alleged Trump connections and the Czech connections to the MAGA movement, even to Russia, when on the other hand, in this House, Sweden's highest democratic organ, they know exactly what the Sweden Democrats stand for and how much we've supported Ukraine, worked against the Russian aggression for at least a decade. Even before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and we worked against that. We fought against the disarmament policy that Morgan Johansson and the Social Democrat government was responsible for. I think this is shocking. We have to look at history and see what we have done and what you have done in relation to the Russian threat. You were living it up. In the history that I went through, and this is being done now, we should all be united on the side of Russia against the Russian aggression. I have also been clear during my years as the security political spokesperson. We have been saying that we have a Trump administration now that is unpredictable, and that at least with rhetorical threats has attacked our neighbor country. I heard said that we should answer this. I haven't heard Morgan Johansson give any suggestions, any concrete ones about how we should answer this, except with words. No actual concrete measures that would have an effect. Now that we have a threat from the USA and a worse threat from Russia and China. Thank you, Morgan Johansson, Social Democrat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I cannot get this all to match. Trump and the US are unpredictable. We hear on the one hand, and noting how they've behaved against Ukraine and Denmark alike, and then a moment later, you're asking for support from Trump. Jimmy Åkesson sitting there saying that he would welcome support to the Sweden Democrats by Trump in the general election. And this is serious, we need to remember. This is not a fantasy world. It's not in our imagination. It's precisely what J.D. Vance and other representatives of the U.S. administration have stated. They are prepared to back up right-wing extremist parties in Europe in upcoming general elections. This is one of the reasons why they support various parties in France, in Germany, in Hungary, in the UK. And it's not support that you get for free. It comes with a price, a cost. And here's my previous question again. If Jimmy Åkesson was Prime Minister or a minister in the next government, which policy can we expect? The one that we hear here on Ukraine, or is it Trump's version that we can expect to see? Thank you, Arne Emilsson, final rejoinder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To begin with, Morgan Johansson must have missed the statement that Jimmy Åkesson signed when the Greenland crisis was at its worst. These package of measures that the Nordic countries, not the least Denmark, need to take now to raise the threshold and to demonstrate that we're against any type of intervention against Greenland. And this is clearly aimed at the present administration in Washington. This is what has happened in the Greenland catastrophe thus far. Further, what Morgan Johansson has referred to, I've said clearly many times that it's clear that Jimmy Jimmy Åkesson has stated that it is indesirable to have any form of foreign influence in the Swedish election. That has been clearly stated, expressly stated. I've seen that on several occasions. And of course, whether or not things go well for one party, that's another thing. But no foreign interference in Swedish elections is desirable. That's been repeated by me, by our party, by Jimmy Åkesson. That's what Morgan Johansson is trying to say to the Swedish people to fool them. Thank you. The rejoinder now is to Håkan Svenneling from the Left Party. Go ahead.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I'd like to welcome Aron Emilsson back to the Riksdag after his parental leave. And I'm wondering about a vote in the European Parliament while Emilsson was on parental leave on the 13th of November last year, because the European Parliament encouraged the EU to deal with measures by authoritarian regimes to force, control or silence political opponents and other critical voices abroad. It's a major problem. We've seen many examples of this occurring in Sweden by various regimes, such as the Iranian one with the prosecution of Swedish Iranians, or the Chechen activist and blogger who was attacked in their home in Gävle a few years ago, and 2 people were sentenced for attempted murder. Another example is the editor Gui Minhai, who was kidnapped from Thailand, brought to China, and who's still in prison since 2015. Chinese actions which we've condemned many times in the Swedish Riksdag. According to Freedom House, we have a total of 1,219 direct physical incidents in 103 countries since 2014. 80% of the cases of cross-border oppressions are committed by 10 countries: China, Russia, Egypt, Turkey, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Cambodia, Uzbekistan, Iran and Belarus. But for some reason, the Sweden Democrats, MEPs Dick Eriksson, Beatrice Timgren and Charlie Weimers, voted against the resolution to do everything we can to put a stop to such persecution. Weimers, who appears to spend most of his time fighting it out with Swedish government agencies, where in addition to his 120,000 kronor per month, he should also be entitled to child allowance, in spite of the fact that he lives with his family in Belgium. I cannot understand this. Why did the Sweden Democrats vote against a resolution which dealt with putting a stop to persecution of human rights defenders? Thank you. Thank you, Aron Emilsson from the Sweden Democrats. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Håkan Svenneling, for the question, which I hope you understand that I will answer. On one hand, I think it's good and important that we show, and that as well can show that we are people, and that I did need to take care of our newborn daughter. And please, I hope understand that I am not all that knowledgeable about this incident in the European Parliament, but we are part of a larger voting package when we do this, and this is a procedure that has been going on for a long time. On the one hand, because we've had quite a lot of other things to think about in consideration of the security policy situation. So I have no great answer for you, but thank you for bringing that up. I don't know that. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, the resolution was adopted in the European Parliament with a large majority. However, the development, the trend that Sweden Democrats are voting against is a sign of the times, because we see how Sweden Democrats are working towards a shrinking democratic margin of maneuver, both in Sweden and globally. And if you listen to the organization Civil Rights Defenders, the TIDO group with the Sweden Democrats out there in the lead have brought in support from organizations who are critical, taken back and cancelled support to organizations that are critical of their policies. They've paid more money to the civil servants who are in favour of the policies of the TIDO group, and publicised several nominations and attacked media, such as public service. A clear example in foreign policy was that certain people are not considered to be entitled to consular aid due to their views, opinions, or from having a dual citizenship. When we vote to remove the Sweden Democrats from power, we will put a stop to the shrinking of this our democracy, both in Sweden and globally. Thank you. Thank you. Final rejoinder from Sweden Democrats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, I don't have full influence over foreign policy these days, but however, we know in the latest election period we know that Håkan Svenneling is aware of many human rights questions, and in countries that have lived under dictatorships such as Iran, we were a driving force behind the Republican Guards being declared a terror organization, and we have been a driving force for insisting that many of its members be denied entry to Sweden, and to put pressure on them to supporting these popular uprisings against the Iranian regime. Once again, the same thing as far as China and vulnerable Christians the world over. We need to realize that we've supported them. Thank you. Thank you. That exchange of rejoinders was finished. Kerstin Lindgren has the floor. Center Party, go ahead.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Aron Emilsson, for your speech. I didn't intend to address this particular matter, but considering the previous round of rejoinder, I do need to ask the question nevertheless. Will the Sweden Democrats say no to support from MAGA for their think tank? Because that's what's been promised, after all, from the US side. It would be good to get a clear answer, not just a general statement on this matter. Mr. Speaker, when I listened to the address, I didn't hear a single word, perhaps I wasn't paying attention, but not a word about the EU. And you simply cannot get away from the fact that when the EU now has to have a much clearer position, when the EU is Sweden's most important security policy arena, I wonder, of course, what the Sweden Democrats think of the EU. If I read your policy program, I see that there should be no more qualified majority decisions in the EU. Is that still the view of the Sweden Democrats? Nor should security be a matter for the EU to deal with. However, what most see is that the EU needs to take a much clearer stance and much clearer in shouldering the responsibility for security and defense in Europe. So is the policy of principles something which still applies? If there's a referendum request, is that what we're going to hear from the Sweden Democrats in the run-up to the general election? And then finally, China. It's been 4 years, and we have yet to see a position, a stance by the government to strengthen Taiwan. And relation to House of Sweden, have we worked on for a long time? The Riksdag has voted in favor. Nothing has happened. Do the Sweden Democrats intend to push this further? Sweden Democrats?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There are a lot of questions there. Let's see what I have time to answer. For the first thing, both I and Henrik Vinge from the leadership of our party have both stated, and we believe that we should be critical if there are proposals for foreign support in the Swedish election. It's reasonable considering that this is the Swedish people's fate we're talking about. As far as a think tank, I have no detailed information about what that would be about. I'd have to look into that and get back to you. But the EU, well, I usually say in different contexts that we need the EU both more than ever and less than ever at the same time. That's a complex picture, but we need to be able to keep two thoughts in our heads at the same time. The EU has a central and important security and political role in this. We gain by scaling up our defense industry, our joint systems, supporting Ukraine with military support, reinforcing our own rearmament and capabilities. We gain by coordinating in the trade war vis-a-vis the U.S. policies and the challenges we have today. However, I still have the understanding that the EU should do less in domestic questions. This is something we say in the European Parliament and in this chamber, which is the Swedish people's highest deciding body. I maintain that opinion. Naturally, if we're talking about transferring competencies to the EU as far as especially domestic political questions, we need to have a referendum. We cannot give the EU new areas of competence or things like that without more discussion. China, I really do hope that we can do everything we can to to work against the Chinese regime, and I think it's very important to stand up for Taiwan. That's very important. Thank you, Kerstin Lindgren.
3 frågor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 3 questions, yes or no? The Sweden Democrats prepared to say no to support to their think tank from the MAGA movement. Surely that should be possible to reply to. If you are critical and you've considered this, you should be able to say yes or no. Yes or no to qualified majority voting in security policy matters in the EU. Yes or no to House of Sweden and Taiwan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. Final rejoinder. Yeah, Sweden Democrats.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can just say that this specific question about support to a think tank has not come up. I can't imagine support to a think tank. I can make a statement on that. Some question concerning party support or the Riksdag's affairs I can get back to, but I've been very clear about how we do not support the MAGA movement or any other political movement in any other or support from any other country or movement in the Swedish election campaign. No, the Sweden Democrats believe that foreign policy should not be the object of qualified majority voting in the EU. Now, as far as the House of Sweden, yes, we're happy that we agree on this question. We both belong to parties that have supported House of Sweden getting grading capabilities and greater ability to do their work out there, and we definitely do support that. Thank you. That exchange of rejoinders is finished. Frederick Malm from the Liberals has the floor for the next rejoinder. Go ahead.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My rejoinder actually connects to the previous one with regard to cooperation in Europe. Now, Aron Emerson's party colleague Mattias Karlsson was the chair of the Foreign Parliamentary Committee in the autumn, and he participated in an interview in the Swedish newspaper Svenska Dagbladet, where Karlsson said that we should promote a Nordic union as opposed to the EU and NATO. He didn't want to leave the EU, but he said that it was important with the Nordic union. But this is a bit worrying, Mr. Speaker, I would say, as a dear friend of Europe, because you can have one with the other, actually, and we have very close cooperation with our neighbours, Nordic neighbours. We've got the Nordic Council, then within the EU as well, and also outside the EU, as not all Nordic countries are members of the EU. And then we also have it within NATO. Now, the problem with all of this is that what you're doing, the Sweden Democrats are doing, is that you are setting or pitting cooperation within the Nordics against the EU. But what we need to do, Mr. Speaker, is to reinforce the Nordic and Nordic-Baltic and Nordic and Baltic Sea area and the European nature to our cooperation within Europe, not to sort of retreat inwards and turn our backs to EU and with an either-or situation and have deeper cooperation when needed. And so when it comes to, the rest of the Nordics, if we're going to be fair, they don't look at Sweden only with admiration. Faith in Sweden. Sweden is always there for the rest of the Nordics, is for historical reasons not perhaps quite as strong amongst our Nordic neighbours. So we need to increase that and with our NATO membership, for example, enhance that. But my question is, was this just a party colleague? He was, in fact, the chairperson of the parliamentary committee. Was it just his view, or was it the view of the party?
Sweden Democrats, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Nordic countries and Poland and Great Britain and so on are our greatest foreign policy priority. I think that's clear. So I don't know why Fredrik Malm believes there's some sort of opposition there or contradiction. This is not about leaving the EU or leaving NATO. It's about strengthening the Nordic pillar. I think we have much more to do in the Nordic context. There's a lot left to do. The Nordic Council being formed is a good thing, but there's more to be done as far as breaking down barriers and so on. But there's much more to do in the security and defense areas as far as military frameworks and deepening our work even in NATO. We've heard some speeches made about that, Stoltenberg and so on. There are loads of things that we could be doing to strengthen the Nordic dimension even within NATO as a defensive alliance. I see no contradiction in this. On the contrary, now that Sweden is taking responsibility for its more presence in Finland, having troops in Latvia and so on, but there's also a number of examples within NATO of good regional cooperation. NATO has no prohibition on this. There's nothing to say we can't strengthen regional cooperation inside the alliance. NATO has itself stated, now that we've collected the Nordic countries in NATO, to make them stronger as far as the Nordic ice cap and so on. We need to strengthen the Nordic defense and security cooperation, absolutely. Thank you, Fredrik Malm, Liberals.
Tack så mycket, herr talman.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Speaker. No, but that's true. The Sweden Democrats do not want to withdraw from the EU, and I am pleased to hear what the Sweden Democrats say on that. And that, however, Mrs. Speaker, what is it that they want to achieve then? Because all these processes and the deeper cooperation when it comes to defence and security policy that Aron Emerson mentioned, these are ongoing processes. At the same time, European cooperation is also deepened, and that's also a process. And the immigration crisis led to an asylum package. The climate crisis has led to a different climate package. The financial crisis led to a stability pact in Europe and the bank union, etc. Every single crisis leads to deeper EU cooperation. So the question then is, the Sweden Democrats, do you just want to rename the Nordic Council? Is that the Nordic Union? We did have a union with Norway. They don't want that again. And then we had the Kalmar Union, which led to a bloodbath. So that is why, we actually have Sweden as a national state today. So perhaps let's clarify what this actually is, what you mean, the Sweden Democrats, by this. Thank you. Thank you. Final rejoinder from Aron Emerson from the Sweden Democrats.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Nordic area is one of the most integrated areas in the world. We share languages, systems, culture, many, many points. And one of the lowest thresholds in the world, I would say, to integrate further. There are loads of things we could do. We could be much better between Nordic countries that are also EU members in coordinating implementation of EU directives. There are a number of examples there where we have coordinated as far as, and where we did not coordinate and implemented EU directives in completely different ways. I think there are negative things there. We need to, we could take down border obstacles, share more intelligence, create more and actual interoperability between ourselves, not the least in defense and security. That's not today's debate. That's another one. Thank you. That exchange of rejoinders is finished. The floor is to Håkan Svenneling for the Left Party. Go ahead.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, yes. A great deal has happened since we held this debate a year ago with Donald Trump as the President of the United States. And gosh, we have a long left of his term. We have to live through 3 more years of this. I normally refer to the period we are living in as the return of the imperialists. It does sound something like something out of Star Wars. Carl Bildt and Aron Emerson here has called it the era of the age of disorder. However, that, I think, leaves out the intentions of the leaders of several states. And that is that they wish to extend their territories through imperialism. This is what they actually want. through threats of violence and actual violence, regardless of whether we're talking about Ukraine, Taiwan or Greenland. But it's not only the three superpowers that are representing an imperialistic ideology. Leaders of countries such as Israel, Syria and Turkey, they are also demonstrating the same types of claims to power. Is Donald Trump an imperialist? Absolutely. His goal of taking over Greenland remains. It is clear that he wishes to be written about in the history books as one of the United States presidents that extended the territory of the US. Is Donald Trump a fascist? Definitely. The state-sanctioned violence of ICE in Minneapolis is a clear example of this. The lives of two people taken without any accountability taken at all. Instead, top civil servants have focused on denigrating the two murder victims, Rennie Good and Jeffrey Pretty. Is Donald Trump the man of billionaires? Absolutely. With his presidency, the financial elites around the world have easy access to power and influence. As long as you keep on the president's good side, your financial interests are safeguarded. Sweden has changed its security policy vis-à-vis China already, from having happily believed that increased trade with China would also lead to democracy and the respect of human rights. China has in recent years rather been regarded based on the security policy threat it represents, in particular as regards its neighbours. The same thing has happened with regard to Russia. Even if Swedes have long been wary of Russians, we also see that the optimism of the 90s, that economic reforms will lead to democracy, these have crumbled as Putin's stronghold of power in the Kremlin has increased. After the full-scale attack against Ukraine 4 years ago, the then government met with all the parties in the Riksdag and agreed to a new security policy analysis, especially with regard to Russia. Now is the time to do the same thing as concerns the US, because just as it is very probable that the next leader in Peking will come from the Communist Party, that the next leader in Moscow will come from Putin's right-wing nationalistic circle, it is also very probable that the next Republican presidential candidate will have MAGA tattooed on their chest. There is a choice to make now. Either we continue with this laissez-faire mentality in the hope that things will improve, the government continues to talk about the transatlantic link and that we can trust America, or we can take what old right-wingers like Carl Bildt and Gunnar Hökmark say seriously and actually redefine Sweden's relationship with the US. This isn't about left or right. It is about how we read and analyse the actual current situation. This is why it is good that the government has given the Defence Committee the task of producing a new analysis for 2020 and updating the one from 2024, and it needs to focus on the United States. Mr. Speaker, a self-evident first step that Sweden must take is to terminate the DCA agreement with the US. We cannot have American soldiers in 17 places across Sweden at the same time as the US threatens our neighbour Denmark and Greenland. When Donald Trump so obviously violates international law, he also constitutes a threat against our security. Mr. Speaker, we now see historically high levels of conflicts across the globe. The number of conflicts has doubled since 2010. In a turbulent world, we need more tools for peace. When the number of conflicts increases globally, Sweden needs both to be a voice and an active player working for peace. Since the 1990s, Norway has been involved as a mediator in over 40 different peace processes by leading and participating in different peace processes. Now, insight into the value of a need for a commitment to making intermediate work more systemic and professional resulted in the Norwegian Foreign Ministry setting up in 2003 a special department for peace and reconciliation. Thereafter, also a trust in 2008, a special trust to support the work for peace diplomacy. So, what is the cost of peace? Well, bearing in mind all the resources that are now being invested in military armament, you might think that the financial cost for creating peace would be huge. However, with only 0.68% of its budget, the Norwegian Foreign Minister's special department manages to conduct its work, and with good results. So we've seen peace in Nepal, for example, an agreement concluded in 20 years ago and more or less adhered to since then, and implemented peace in Colombia 10 years ago, which led to the end of a long-lasting conflict, and that came to an end. Peace in the Philippines leading to the establishment of the independent region Mindanao. In 2025, 26,000 of in total 40,000 combatants will have been demobilized. Sweden could, like Norway, be a player for peace. In an era when conflicts and wars are increasing in number, we must, together with other states, constitute a force for peace. However, then we need to ensure that we achieve the goals of the UN, no poverty, etc., and we need to fight climate change. And we can't forget conflicts in the African continent or have faith in nuclear weapons, which always impact mostly civilians. And here in this statement of foreign policy, we don't hear the word diplomacy, which is something that needs to be at the heart of our foreign policy. We don't want the return of the imperialists. No, we want the return of peace. And at the same time, we see across the world how people are fighting against the ambitions of imperialists in Iran, for example. The people have once again risen against the mullahs, their regime. This terrible massacre was the response from the regime. But the signs are clear. One day, the regime in Iran will fall. In Syria, the Kurds and other peoples are showing that there is a mosaic of different group of peoples in Syria, and they are in opposition there. And in Turkey, the Kurd question is finally high up on the agenda, and the work of the parliamentary committee gives rise to feelings of hope with regard to reconciliation, release, and the future. In Palestine, the Palestinians are continuing to fight against centuries of imperialism, as many decisions are being made above their heads. At the same time, the last year has been important, as state after state has now recognized Palestine as a state. In Europe, we see how people in Belarus and Georgia are protesting against the powers that be when they are running the errands of Putin. And we're seeing funds from Russia going into Moldova, but the people of Moldavia voted for Europe. And Ukraine and their strength is impressive and continues to be impressive. The attack by Russia has failed. The Ukrainians every day struggle and fight for their freedom. At the same time, as we see these people fight, many people ask us, why doesn't Sweden do more? And the people who come here, for example, for protection from the violence and oppression of these imperialists, that this Riksdag instead wants to deport teenagers is nothing other than shameful, that needs to be stopped immediately. Thank you very much. Thank you. And the following have requested rejoinders: Kerstin Lundgren from the Centre Party, Magnus Berntsson from the Christian Democrats, and Fredrik Malmer from the Liberal Party, please. First down is Kerstin Lundgren from the Centre Party, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened to Håkan Svenneling now to hear how he views solutions as far as our security and what challenges we face. I understand that when you read their homepage, you can read a lot about both capital and all sorts of things, the usual rhetoric that they want to take up the fight about. But my question is about the EU. The EU and EU treaties are all supposed to be combated and fought against and so on, but the EU is something we need. The EU is the most important foreign policies and security policy forum we have right now, together with NATO. And it is entirely foreign to us how the left party sees the EU and the EU's role in building up security together with NATO. So I would like to hear what Håkan Svenneling and the left party thinks about the EU. That's my question. Thank you, Håkan Svenneling, left party.
Herr talman, jag tycker...
Mr. Speaker, I think Kerstin Lundgren is missing the most important point with regard to an arena for security policy, and that is the United Nations, actually. That's the main problem with this government's policy, is that they have turned away from the UN and the accountability that you can have there, instead focusing on others. And I also think that Kerstin Lundgren is treading a very dangerous path when she mixes the EU and NATO. Naturally, both these institutions are based in have their headquarters in Brussels, yes, and that there are services that are shared. But the EU is the EU and NATO is NATO. And if in the Swedish debate we can't differentiate between the two, we're treading a very dangerous path, because this is what I warn against NATO membership. I warned against that. And I think that what we've heard here, what we've heard mentioned here today as a problem is what I've required before. We can't trust the United States. We need our own defence, a strong defence, and we need to work with other equally minded states in our vicinity. We need to be pro a regionalisation of NATO, where we ourselves can decide about our vicinity together with our neighbours, and we do not want other countries intervening and deciding and etc. And I think that the EU alongside NATO can, of course, fulfil a role as regards our security. We have the Left Party been in favour of some of the initiatives that have been complementary from this side of the EU. But what we lack, we don't have generals, we do not have military structures. And I think it's very dangerous if we think that we can build up a European army within the EU that should then cover for the United States. No, we need a strong Swedish defence, that everything is in Sweden, that we do not trust anybody else. Nor can we have faith in a nuclear umbrella, whether it's Swedish or American or whatever. Thank you very much. Rejoinder from Kerstin Lundgren.
Well, that sounds exciting, because I wanted to ask a question when I heard that last one. Hear him asking that? I expected to hear him asking the question, will the Centre or the Sweden Democrats want to build Swedish nuclear weapons, since we no longer trust the USA, as the France has clearly stated, and Great Britain is interested in participating in that among others. But I hear Håkan Svenneling saying we actually should not trust anyone. Security is something we build together with like-minded states, and the EU has that. We have structures. Just yesterday, we could see that Canada had joined SAFE, which is part of a resource to build stronger military capabilities. This is not an EU army. This is building capabilities. Thank you very much. Håkan Svenneling, Left Party, go ahead.
Mr. Speaker, now I perhaps understand why the Centre Party is so lost in Swedish foreign policy, because it thinks that the Sweden Democrats and the Left Party are supposed to be working together. We see and we are the huge threat that you always have to mention. But the Left Party, we are very clear on the fact that we are against nuclear weapons, regardless of their nationality. We need to work against nuclear armament, which is why we're in favour of a proposal. We're working more with diplomacy with regard to peace than this government is doing currently. And we also need to remember that Canada is not part of the EU. It's good that we can be part of the SAFE instrument, but geographically, of course, they're in North America. But in the EU, there is a Trojan horse called Hungary, which is very, very close to Vladimir Putin, in that he visits Moscow when they have the presidency of the EU, and they consistently work against every single attempt to bring Ukraine closer to Europe and the EU. So we cannot, as you do, Kerstin Lundgren, have faith in the EU in this situation. Thank you. That was the end of that round of rejoinders. And the next is with Magnus Berntsson from the Christian Democrats, please.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, Member Svenneling spoke a lot about peace. And Håkan Svenneling suggested recently, or was involved in suggesting recently, Francesca Albanese, nominating her for the Nobel Peace Prize. Several countries, France, Germany and Italy, have publicly requested her that she resigns. She's been working in the Palestinian areas and territories. At the Al Jazeera forum in Doha, she made statements that have drawn heavy criticism. The criticism was based on her statements, and I quote, "We who do not control large parts of the capital algorithms and weapons and arms, we perceive that there's a shared enemy for humanity, that the support by the Western world to Israel would contribute to such a situation." She attributed to Israel the role of the common enemy of humanity. A special UN envoy is expected to be correct and neutral and considerate in their statements. When you are considered as partial, it will impact the image of the UN as a whole. So my question to Håkan Svenneling is this: do you maintain your nomination of this person to the UN, to the Nobel Peace Prize, since she has named Israel the common enemy of humanity? Håkan Svenneling, you have the floor.
Mr. Speaker, well, formally, I think that I missed sending in the nomination before the 31st of January, but it is true that I have said that I think that she should receive the Peace Prize. And I think it's reasonable, actually, because she has always supported international law when violations against it have been more and greater than for a long time. And we have witnessed genocide in Gaza, where the world has done far too little to stop it, and I believe that the support that the world has given to Israel after the awful attack from Hamas on the 7th of October, then it was a green light and go ahead to Israel to do what they wanted, and that led to the genocide. And I think that she has released a number of important reports stating the crimes that Israel is said to have committed by the court in The Hague, and all support to Israel and companies, etc. Their support, for example, Volvo is an example of that, and Alfa Laval, where you can see that Swedish products from these companies are being used both in the occupation of the West Bank as well as in Gaza for different ways, for example, destroying and the demolition of buildings. We need to take this question seriously, and I don't think that we have to a great enough extent. But it is true, on the other hand, that I don't agree in this black and white description talking about enemies and common enemy against the world. I can't support everything as she says. And I think it's also very important that you are able to keep track of things, so that you don't start with anti-Semitic statements, that you're saying that it's the fault of the Jewish people. I am often very clear in that it's the Israeli government, which is a right-wing nationalist government. This is what we're critical to. And Netanyahu, many of his ministers and previous ministers are also wanted, as it were, by the ICC for these violations against international. Thank you very much. Second rejoinder, please, from Magnus Berntsson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I take it that the member is of the opinion that it is possible and permissible to say things such as Israel being the common enemy of the world and still being nominated to the Nobel Peace Prize, if you remember to make the submission of that nomination. Of course, let me remind you that the criticism against Albanese did not occur just now. It started way before this proposal to nominate Albanese to the Nobel Peace Prize. She has made statements which has really made people turn away from her, that the US would be subordinate. The Jewish lobby, for example, that's uncomfortably close to classical conspiracy theories. She has questioned the reasons for the attack on 7th of October. And my question remains, therefore, is Håkan Svenneling of the opinion that such statements can be combined with the moral authority and the good judgment that should characterize a laureate of the Nobel Peace Prize? Is this what the member intends by saying that this is the return of peace? Thank you very much, Håkan Svenneling from the Left Party. Final rejoinder.
Well, I think it's up to the Nobel Peace Committee to determine that, who receives the award. I think it's a bit up and down, especially in the last year when they chose a Venezuelan opposition politician where I see that, I mean, there's who is being oppressed but takes very little responsibility for the Venezuelan people and has supported the violations against human rights that Trump has committed there. So I've also proposed earlier that Greta Thunberg should also receive the Peace Prize. And I think that you can criticize the statements made by Albanese, and that she must be, you have to be clear here that you don't end up in these anti-Semitic tropes. But everyone who's had the job that Albanese has had have always been criticized. And I know one of her predecessors who received the Palmer Award recently, which shows that it's very difficult to speak about Israel clearly without meeting massive criticism from the Israeli side. Thank you very much. That's the end of that round of rejoinders. And the next rejoinders are with Malmer from the Liberal Party, please.
Tack så mycket, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Håkan Svenneling argues, and many others too, including myself, argued that we mustn't be too dependent on countries such as China and the US here in Europe. Well, then it's just brilliant, isn't it, that the European Union, after 26 years of negotiations, now, only a few weeks ago, was able to confirm the Mercosur Free Trade Agreement. It would open up a market with 700 million consumers, creating the world's largest free trade area. At the same time as Trump is claiming Greenland and the Ukraine war is being waged continuously and China taking various actions. And what happens? Well, Håkan Svenneling and his friends in the Left Party and Green Party members from Sweden with the farm lobby in France and Poland and right and left-wing extremists and Putin loyalists and various all and sundry putting a spanner in the works, trying to sink it straight into the wall, referring it to the Court of Justice of the European Union for 2 years. This means that the EU and European companies will miss out on approximately 4.5 billion euro every month in potentially lost customs charges because there would have been customs-free exports. This is a serious problem for Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, etc., etc. They lose out on the chance for better growth, and you could have created a more independent Europe, built a stronger Europe in relation to other large powers who are acting to promote another world order. What was your reasoning in the Left Party, I have to ask? Thank you very much. Håkan Svenneling.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your question. I'm very happy that you asked that because the Foreign Minister wondered the same thing, but I didn't have time to answer her question, so now we have the time to do that. Now, our dependence on the US needs to be reduced, not least in light of Donald Trump's very damaging trade policy, with tariffs, etc. We need to create new trade patterns globally, and the Mercosur agreement has both pros and cons to it. We need to see them. For example, deforestation risk as well is inherent in it, and there are a number of other matters as well. So there are concerns, definitely. We need, for example, we have animal welfare and food security and that are included there as well. However, we need to increase or lessen our dependence rather on the US. So the Mercosur agreement, for example, is more important. And we were previously against an agreement where there was a trade clause where companies could go beyond trading, but there was no such clause, which is why we're in favour of this. And you are referring to the vote in January in the European Parliament, and the Left Party voted for the EU to use the correct process and not round the Parliament. So we need to do that in order for it to come into force. We want as good an agreement as possible, and when there is a vote on the Mercosur agreement itself, we will vote yes to that. I think it's also important to remember that all the party groups, there were members that voted for this legal process, and at a time when we are really in a bit more turmoil than usual, we're not following the rules as we usually do. I think it's extra important that the EU does in fact comply with the rules that we have set. Thank you, Malmer from the Liberal Party, for his final rejoinder.
Tack så mycket, herr talman.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the Left Party is in favour of the Mercosur agreement, says Håkan Svenneling, but there was a vote a few weeks ago and you voted against. You've referred it to the Court of Justice. It could take another 2 years, but it'll all come back, says Håkan Svenneling. But So I take it, Mr. Speaker, that the Left Party is of the opinion that the free trade agreement is a little bit too extensive. It came in at too early a point in time. It's not enough that this has been worked over and over between member states, the European Commission, the European Parliament, negotiators and the South American country for 26 years at this stage. That's not enough for the Left Party. Clearly, they have to sabotage the whole process, refer it to the court for another 2 years, and the matter remains. The question remains to Håkan Svanling, why are entrepreneurs from Argentina and animal breeders in Uruguay, why should they pay for the anti-free trade approach of the Left Party in the EU? This is so ridiculous. It's going to cost tens of billions. Håkan Svanling, the Left Party final rejoinder.
Mr. Speaker, the European Parliament voted on a procedural issue, not the agreement itself, in how it should be dealt with it before the European Parliament. And then they chose to choose a correct path, which goes through the court. And that is what's going to happen. And I think the right is a bit confused with what the Left Party thinks here, because we're suddenly in favour of a free trade agreement, and so therefore, because we're voting in favour of a procedural issue together with Liberal MEPs, etc., MEPs from other countries, just so that we should comply with the rules that we have set, so that we shouldn't undermine the environmental rules that we have set. So this is very important that we actually maintain protection for Swedish consumers, for Swedish producers, so that we don't try to press things through the system too quickly. We see this in migration when things happen too quickly without listening to authorities and experts. It's the same thing here. It has to take time, but let's get the Mercosur agreement in place at one stage in the future. That's the end of that round of rejoinders. And next we have the address of Kerstin Lundgren from the Centre Party, please.
Talman, Rysslands
Speaker, Russia's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine is coming into its 5th year, but it was started 12 years ago in Crimea, Donetsk and Luhansk. The idea behind it is the neo-imperialism that Putin developed after he took back presidential power in 2011. Kremlin considers it has the historic right to grab countries it considers as theirs, regardless of recognized territorial borders. It's not the first time this happens in history, but based on the lessons learned from the Second World War, countries agreed on another order was codified in the UN Charter, which served us and the world well ever since. The multilateral order, which shaped the post-Second World War era, is in a period of change, in transition. How it changes depends on Sweden's willingness and ability to cooperate, use its voice, but also the willingness of large nuclear powers, based on its different and sometimes interests that align. Russia would like to see a multipolar order where they take their position, and the war and aggression on Ukraine is a Russian investment to achieve that goal. They want to recreate themselves as a major power, and the Ukrainians are paying the ultimate price. They sacrifice themselves for the survival of their country, for their freedom, for their right to choose their own future. And for us, we need to realize that Sweden and our partners could be next in line. The disorder which prevails requires us to swiftly arm ourselves financially, militarily, and on a humane level. The military capability needs to be strengthened in Sweden. The 5% targets need to be achieved as quickly as possible, and the strength of our combined capabilities and our resilience determine whether these memberships are strong enough to create the necessary deterrence and a protection of our values, our independence, and our freedom. This term of office, Sweden has focused on supporting Ukraine, and it has been necessary, although we've been a bit sluggish, slow, scared, and it hasn't been enough. Sweden has to continue and secure sustainable support to Ukraine socially, economically, militarily, and in terms of EU membership. The Centre Party has demanded and still demands that Sweden attributes 1% of GDI to Ukraine, that we set up a Ukrainian fund outside the budget. That's how we can have a long-term credibility and predictability for this support. That needs to be the characteristics for our Sweden. Ukraine shall not, from any power, be forced to untenable agreements. The price of such will be a price paid by all of us in the end. We live in worrying times. We need to be prepared to retry and reassess old truths, but not our values. We will actively opt for liberal values which formed and shaped our country, democracy, a welfare that works for the country as a whole, giving trust and belief in the future, our openness, our humanity, a well-functioning, independent judiciary, freedom of the speech. We mustn't take the path of autocrats and try to imitate their rhetorics or agendas. Centre Party choose cooperation with like-minded countries in the Nordics, in the Baltics, and in the EU. Together with, for example, Canada, we work strategically and proactively to promote and strengthen the belief in the values which are under threat at home and globally. We need to realize that the old world order is gone. We need to try and gather strong support to promote basic principles and to reform institutions. We need to secure that power and might doesn't go before right, neither in Ukraine nor in Greenland, in the Arctic or anywhere else. In order to cope with these challenges, we need a stronger European cooperation. Sweden's voice must be clear, respectful, and it must be possible to trust Sweden and Sweden's voice, a country that doesn't go silent when people's rights and freedoms are oppressed, regardless of whether it's in China, Iran, Belarus, Russia, Georgia, or Turkey. Regardless of country, Sweden will support people who fight for the freedom of themselves and their country and against terrorism, regardless of whether it be Ukraine's war for their freedom, the fight and struggle of Iranians from freedom from the brutal oppression of the mullahs, people fighting for democracy in Hong Kong, or the Palestinians fighting for rights and independence. Sweden will support international law, liability, accountability, and compliance with court rulings that return of immigrants and the own interests of our country alone are prioritized by the government is devaluating our approach, and it's an example to others in the multilateral system. We are more and more similar to other countries with their own agenda. Sweden is one more voice for a conditioned development aid, a transactional country. Instead of investing in development and global goals, they want the settlement and emergency aid. Anna Lasses will later on go more in-depth into the details of the approach of the Centre Party to development aid, where we want to raise it to 1% of GDI without reducing the contributions to Ukraine. We want a special Ukraine fund that we've proposed. EU is our most important foreign policy arena, Mr. Speaker. We need to strengthen it with more qualified majority decision-making, better competitiveness, and better ability to defend the EU and Europe within the European NATO. The transatlantic link remains important, but it has been weakened as a result of the current US administration's agenda, but also as a result of the values which are promoted globally and in relation to the EU, including territorial claims against NATO allies, with the clear politics of spheres of interest expressed by the US. There are threats against both Denmark and Greenland. The US is a strong voice in favor of autocrats who would like to see the spheres of interest of great powers as the order, a multipolar world where independent countries need to be submissive. Once again, it's important for Sweden and together and other like-minded countries step forward, speak up for multilateral rules, independence and freedom of choice. We need to secure the basis upon which the EU rests. It's interest for Sweden. We promote democracy and freedom. In a time of disorder, which currently prevails, Sweden needs to support important norms and agreements, stand up for a reformed UN, basic fundamental convention, but also NPT and the Paris Agreement. The climate is a matter of survival for humanity, and we mustn't turn a blind eye or defer our responsibility to our children and grandchildren. They will bear the brunt of the cost for the fact that we've closed our eyes to facts for too long. The world, for the first time, has experienced a 3-year period where the average temperature on average exceeded 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial levels. The CO2 levels reached new peaks in 2025. We see how extreme weather events are affecting us all significantly, with floods and storms, brutal heat waves affecting humans, food provision, the economy nationally and globally. A climate agenda focused on the future for Sweden, for the EU and the world is something which is of central and crucial Swedish interest. We need to get the emissions down, and the growth for both Sweden and the EU need to go up. The green transition is an injection to new sustainable technology, more jobs, strengthening of our economy and strategic autonomy, a strengthening of our security, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Thank you very much. And we have a request for rejoinders by Aron Emilsson of the Sweden Democrats. You have the floor for your rejoinder.
I'd like to thank Kerstin Lundgren for her speech. And both Kerstin Lundgren and Morgan Johansson mentioned China. You both make a claim to cooperation, but you speak in very different tones as far as China and China's support to Russia. I heard the Social Democrats praising trade relations with China, perhaps that we perhaps should not trade in certain goods or such. Previous policies perhaps should apply, but despite the fact that China supports the Russian war, and China is our greatest security threat. So I'd like to ask the center and the Social Democrats whether they want to continue the 90s security policy, or will you be continuing to support Taiwan against the Chinese threat? Are you prepared to support the West's sanctions against China's war economy? And do you agree with the Social Democrats? Do you agree with the Social Democrats in any questions as far as the dimension of the security threat against the global order? Thank you very much. That is China. Thank you very much, Kerstin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I could just put up a mirror. I could hold it up and ask Aron Emilsson, in fact, if he agrees with the government on in terms of their China policy. Because if there's one thing we've seen is that the government and the Minister of Foreign Affairs confirmed and that she visited China and emphasizing trade policy as important, however, did nothing over the 4-year period when it comes to Taiwan. We've been in agreement here. We've had a majority in this chamber to strengthen the Swedish presence and upgrade our relations with Taiwan. This is important at this point in time because Taiwan is experiencing a threat perhaps this year or 2027. It has been designated as a year that China is getting ready to attack and take over Taiwan, it has been said. So we need to take action in time and react together with like-minded countries, strengthening our support and put a stop to all such plans from China to carry out this threat. China is a large country, after all, and regardless of government, we need and will have trading with China, but it's crucial that we do not proceed in the manner in which we have previously. We need to identify security-related risks. We've been clear on Chinese strategic investments in Sweden in various geographies, and it's important to see, for example, when we have exports of products with dual use, that we need to secure that they are not turned into some sort of trapdoor to Russian needs, say, where products are being passed on from the Swedish side to then be found in weapons developed for use by the Russian army. There are many ways to try and act, but we're not discussing this together with the Social Democrats. We are taking action as an independent party. I'm not sure what the Sweden Democrats are doing. Aron Emilsson for the Sweden Democrats, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If we're doing anything, we are going back to our own parties for the first thing. So I can say that on the one hand, I don't agree with Kerstin Lundgren's description of what the government did. but also there's a step further as far as strategic protection and resilience against China, and most of all, gathering strength with the Western countries and see what the West does about the Russian war economy. The bank and finance sector has provided Russia with products they can use in their war against Ukraine. I also thought the foreign minister was clear in the position on China. We cooperate when Swedish interests require it, but we do not accept any security threat from China. I did hear that the Social Democrats in the center agree on China as far as soft power and hard security power. Thank you. Final rejoinders, Kirsten Lindgren, Center. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Centre Party, and I represent the Centre Party from this podium, we represent our own policies, not one that has been negotiated. Perhaps Aron Emilsson, however, represents one policy that he has negotiated with the government and is entering into the general elections as part of such an agreement. That's not the case for the Centre Party. And I note that nothing has happened when it comes to the legal assistance agreement that we've adopted here, which we would cancel as far as Hong Kong is concerned, because that is a remainder of some remnant of the One China, Two Systems policy, which is no longer applicable. I did not get any reply on that point either. So you need to do your lesson in the Sweden Democratic Party to negotiate with the government on the policy that you would like to put forward together coming into the election. And as regards China, thank you. Thank you very much. That concludes this round of rejoinders. And Magnus Berntsson of the Christian Democrats, says the speaker. No repositioning, the speaker misspoke originally. Such cooperation has not been on the cards for many years. You have the floor for the Christian Democrats.
Mr. Speaker, we're living in a time when authoritarian powers are moving their positions forward, and people around the world have been paying a high price for standing up their rights. At such a time, our foreign policy must be clear, it must be anchored in our values, but also in responsibility. Mr. Speaker, this weekend, hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Munich. They were supporting the demonstrations in Iran. They were carrying pictures of those that were killed. They shouted names that the regime wanted to silence. They demanded freedom, dignity, and the end of persecution. I was one of the speakers myself, and expressed our country's support for all brave Iranians that are now in this struggle. And I also had the opportunity to meet Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, who actually is a leader of the movement that is demanding an end to the Islamic Republic. He spoke about an Iran that one day can be free, secular, and democratic, an Iran where power belongs to the people and where the rule of law has replaced the rule of fear. The Iranian regime has answered the protests with brutal repression. People have been shot in broad daylight. Women have been beaten because they refused to submit to coercion. Students, journalists, and minorities have been persecuted. The protests have been violently repressed, and even more people have been imprisoned. This is not a series of isolated attacks. This is a system that doesn't work the way it was intended, a system that works exactly the way it was built, a system that is dependent on the application of violence and fear. The Revolutionary Guard's task is to make sure to protect the regime at any price and to spread the regime outside of the borders of its country. It has made the Iranian regime the single largest contributor to instability and violence in the Middle East. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard, being classified as a terror organization, was a necessary decision, and Sweden has long supported this decision. But we need also to sanction those who support this system with their financial networks and family structures. Russian oligarchs have been sanctioned for their war of aggression, and Iran's oligarchs should be sanctioned as well. We need to strengthen our support to civil society and contribute to securing access to the internet and free information. Mr. Speaker, Iran is not an isolated country. It is one of the worst conflicts in our time. The Russian brutal war of aggression against Ukraine is the most determining conflict of our time, and how this war ends will shape Europe's security for generations. Therefore, support to Ukraine is both a moral and solidarity act, but also an investment in our own security. Sweden must continue to stand by Ukraine's side politically, militarily, and financially as long as is necessary. We have shown and need to continue to show our ability to act, to continue to increase pressure on Russia through sanctions, freeze. We need to make sure that frozen Russian assets are used to rebuild Ukraine, and need to make sure that a special tribunal is established to hold those responsible for Russia's crime of aggression are held to account. Sweden's membership in NATO is a historic step. We are no longer alone. At the same time, membership means responsibility. We are strengthening the security in the Baltic Sea region, in the Nordic area, in the Arctic. EU is our most important foreign policy platform in a world characterized by conflict and competition. Europe needs to be strong, unified, and capable of action. The EU's support to Ukraine is decisive. The EU's expansion to Ukraine, Moldavia, and countries of the Western Balkans is a geostrategic investment in freedom, in peace and stability. Security is also about the economy, trade, and the ability to resist. We need to deepen our cooperation with like-minded parties in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We need to defend the rule-based trade order and reduce dangerous unilateral action. We must also clarify our view on China. China is the world's next largest economy and plays a central role in global trade and technological development, but the country is at the same time an authoritarian one. It departs from and undermines international norms and freedom. Sweden can no longer trust that it is a reliable alternative for our economy and security. The goal has to be to reduce our dependency and not put all our eggs in one basket. We should not be dependent on one actor who uses its financial investments as tools to exercise control. We should remember Europe's previous dependence on Russian energy. We need to strengthen the European and transatlantic value chains, diversify our partnership, and at the same time defend our democratic principles against pressure from Peking. At the same time, as of course we affirm dialogue and cooperation where it is in line with our interests and values. Mr. Speaker, Sweden should also be a strong aid donor, supporting Ukraine is important, and our reductions of aid have just been limited to a few percent. Sweden is the fourth largest giver of aid in the world per capita. We have the strongest aid strategy ever, and we need to concentrate where humanitarian aid is greatest. From Gaza to Sudan and other crisis areas, Swedish aid to sexual and reproductive health and rights and equality, and global health is a central part of our foreign policy. This is about dignity. We need to prevent conflicts before they get greater. We need to channel our aid to a greater extent through to civil society actors. Mr. Speaker, from Kiev to Tehran, we see that people that risk everything for freedom and hope are there. We need to support them, not replace them. We need to stand for human rights. We stand for taking international responsibility and protecting Sweden's own peace, security, and peace. Thank you very much. Thank you. Håkan Svenneling from the Left Party, Rebecca Briesberg, and the floor is first to the Left Party. Go ahead.
Herr talman, grunden.
Mr. Speaker, the basis for the conflict where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were transported in the Al-Napa in 1948, and then the Six-Day Wars in 1967 when Israel occupied Gaza, the West Bank and Eastern Jerusalem in breach of the international law. With the Oslo Agreement, the West Bank was divided into A, B and C areas as they were categorized with different types of rules and governance. And since the Oslo Agreement, the number of Israeli settlers in the West Bank have gone up by 4 or 5 times over. More than 30 years down the line, this has also meant that the map of the West Bank looks like a Swiss cheese with separate infrastructures for Palestinians and settlers, respectively. But for Palestinians, in spite of this separation, the meetings of violent settlers is part of everyday life. 1,800 attacks were registered in 2025 and over 1,000 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank. Now, Israel's right-wing extremist government is taking yet another step to expand the annexation of the West Bank. They're trying to achieve a split in a northern and a southern part, separated from each other by way of settlers living between the two areas, the so-called E1 area. No later than Sunday, on the 8th of February, a new decision was adopted to strengthen the Israeli military control of the West Bank, making it even more difficult for Palestinians to prove the right to land and easier for settlers to purchase land and expand their territories. And only Monday of this week, there was a new definition of 60% of the West Bank by Israel as a state-owned and controlled Israeli land. 300,000 Palestinians lived and 325,000 settlers also lived there. That is the right-wing government's supporters, in fact. Even Donald Trump has now been upset by these most recent Israeli decisions, but there's been no clear condemnations. What is the view of the Christian Democrats on the right-wing extremist government's decisions in Israel? Thank you very much. The Christian Democrats, you have the floor.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, the Christian Democrats have always been clear that settler politics is an obstacle to reaching peace. It is not consistent with the decisions that have been made in the UN, and the Christian Democrats and the governments have been clear in their criticism of the plans for the so-called E1 area, which is a larger problem than an ordinary settlement area. It's a way of cutting off the entire West Bank and making it even harder to find ways to reach peace in the future. That's actually where we are right now. We need to begin discussing peace agreements instead in the Middle East. This is part of moving on to Part 2 of the so-called peace plan. We have not seen any concrete steps there yet, but this is what needs to happen in order to reach long-term stability in the area where people can live side by side and together see that they have much more to gain by working together and cooperating instead of the opposite. So despite all the problems that we see with Trump's so-called peace council, this is the first time actually since the decisions taken in the Oslo Agreement, that we may have an opportunity to get new peace talks started, which would be something very desirable. Thank you. Thank you very much. Håkan Sundling, Left Party, go ahead.
Tack, Magnus.
Thank you for that point of clarity. I think it's very important that Sweden is very clear when it comes to all criticism against Israel, because it's very clear that these extreme right-wing ministers and several members of the government, that they have in fact expressed that they want to eradicate the possibility for a Palestinian state by separating not just two parts, the West Bank and Gaza, but also in a northern and southern part. However, I think the government has been too unclear on this matter and has spoken too much, used X, the Elon Musk platform, too much. I don't think that's enough for me, and we need things at the EU level. Absolutely, that's good that that's happening, but at the same time we see Hungary and other countries like Hungary, they always block that type of decision. Now we need to increase pressure, so we need peace, two-state solution, and then you can't get away with violating peace plans or even the Oslo Agreement, which was concluded earlier. Thank you very much. Final rejoinder from Marcus Berntron from the Christian Democrats, please.
Thank you. A negotiated two-state solution is the only solution that we Christian Democrats see as possible. It's not easy. It's not simple. In recent years, the parties have not gotten closer to each other, but a number of things have happened that speak to the conclusion that there may be a greater possibility for the Gulf states to get involved in the question. There may be a great interest from countries in the vicinity to have normalization processes with Israel, which they're also using as pressure on the Israel government to proceed with a negotiated two-state solution, which also is part of what is in the so-called peace plan. Thank you. Thank you very much. That exchange of rejoinders was finished. And Jacob Riesberg from the the Green Party is next. Go ahead.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, there was one matter in the previous round of rejoinders that sort of made me stop and think. And that was when Berntron said that the Christian Democrats have always been clear on the matter that settlers' policy is wrong. I can't remember exactly what you said there, but you did say that. Sorry, the member said that the Christian Democrats have always been clear on this matter. Now, in August 2023, we've spoken about this previously earlier, Berntron, you went, in fact, to Israel together with KKL, which is a settlers organization, and you've continued to make that type of journey, the Christian Democrats, with, for example, different organizations. And the Christian Democrats have also invited Yehuda Glick, which is that's an Israeli settler and activist, Yehuda Aptal, who is a member of the Knesset for a religious Zionism party, and invited them to the Swedish Riksdag. And this party, religious Zionism, the leader is Modric, who is a member of the Netanyahu-led government, and one of these extreme ministers that we want to issue sanctions against, that some countries have already done. They want humanitarian cleansing, and they want. And in May last year, the Christian Democrats also invited settler lobbyist Kontrovich as well. So there's. So I don't know whether they are naive and that they don't really know who they are mingling with, because actually just a simple search on Google can tell you what type of organization we're talking about, the people that they've invited. Either they are naive, or actually it's not true. The Christian Democrats haven't always said that the settler policy is wrong and should come to an end. So I would like to know what actually is the truth. Second, the rejoinder from the Christian Democrats, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It feels like we're getting back to previous questions that this member Jacob Riesberg has had previously. there are areas where we really have different views as far as KPL, which does not accord with the view that Member Riesberg says he has. The KKL Sweden was what I thought was a very serious, or is what I thought was a very serious organization. As far as the other invitations the member mentions, I will say that some of them were not at all made in the Christian Democrats' name. For example, there's a large gathering where there were members of all parties of the Knesset present. Sometimes delegations came to Sweden where we received, for example, delegations from Germany, including AFD in that delegation. What should we do? Should we, in that situation, should we say, well, no, you can't be here? I think the most important thing you can do in those situations is to be clear about what we think in these issues and what we're trying to do in those contexts. And as far as what always, the word always in what I said, well, you can strike the word always in that example, but we do believe that the Israeli settler policy is an impediment to peace, and we want to see a two-state solution. Thank you. The Greens, go ahead.
Thank you for your response. Perhaps we have different views with regard to the KKL and what type of organisation they are. But KKL, what type of organisation? Well, it's part of the Jewish National Foundation, which was established in 1901. And the aim was to purchase and acquire as much land as possible in the then Palestine. And in the Jewish foundation, it says that only Jews may build homes on the land that the foundation owns. Now, they own 17% of the land of Israel. 17% of the land. That's where Israeli Palestinians may not build homes in those areas. They planted trees and built parks in villages that used to be Palestinian, so that no trace of these Palestinian villages are visible. And they've invested millions in purchasing, acquiring land, also in the West Bank. So it's a settler organisation, Member Berntsson. Final rejoinder from Marcus Berntsson, please, from the Christian Democrats.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, I don't understand, or I don't believe that I and Member Riesberg have the same view of what Sweden stands for. KKL Sweden, there are a number of Christian Democrats that went down to see the work they've done as far as planting forests, not the least, in different areas. But what's important now is that the peace process needs to proceed. There is an opportunity now, actually, which we must not miss on the world's behalf. We have the opportunity to arrive at a negotiated two-state solution where the parties in the area are involved and agree to help out. This is what can change the matters at their foundation and get us to a situation where people can live together in the area. Go ahead. Thank you. That exchange of rejoinders is finished. The floor is to Jakob Riesberg from the Greens. Go ahead.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, in a prison cell in Hong Kong, the journalist Jimmy Lai, 78 years old, is sitting. Last week, he was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment under Hong Kong's national security law. His newspaper, Apple Daily, has been closed down, the editorial staff silenced, and the message to other journalists is crystal clear. Just try and scrutinise the powers that be, and you risk disappearing. This is no isolated case, Mr. Speaker. This is a method, a way to step-by-step dismantle democracy by starting with those that reveal the abuse of power. Mr. Speaker, we are living through an era where democracy is shrinking. We see it in packed prison cells, we see it in closed news teams and demonstrations being stopped with violence, and we see it in the figures as well. Over 300 journalists were imprisoned at the end of 2025, and China, Myanmar and Israel are the countries that imprisoned the most. When journalists are being put in prison, it's not just a matter of them being deprived of their liberty. It is the air that is being taken out of society. When the freedom of the press is being suffocated, corruption becomes more serious, as does the violence, and the abuse of power is no longer a risk. This is why defending journalists and the freedom of expression must be at the core of Swedish foreign policy, not just a footnote, not just something secondary, something that you just happen to mention when it's convenient to do so. And when this question becomes uncomfortable but necessary, and if the government is serious about defending democracy, international law and a rules-based order, what is Sweden actually doing in practice when the world is getting darker? Because it is in an era when journalists are being silenced, when human rights defenders are hunted and international law is jeopardized, then Sweden's voice should be clear. It should be consistent. It should be present, not just in fine speeches. It should be present in priorities, in decisions concerning development aid, and also in diplomatic leadership. Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Minister spoke about democracy and the importance of rules and about joint rules and institutions. But we also see the government withdrawing from the things that actually build this in the world. The government stays silent despite the fact that the air attacks over Gaza have intensified again. They defend trade in weapons with the United Arab Emirates, despite the fact that the country is making the conflict in Sudan worse, and it's cutting back on the long-term tools as well. This year alone, it has cut support to the UN body UNDP by 92% and halved the support to the Democracy Institute idea. These are no minor technical adjustments, Mr. Speaker. These are political signals, and the signal is that Sweden is backing away from its role as a voice in favour of democracy and international law, just when that voice is most needed. Mr. Speaker, under the Tidö government, Sweden's voice has become cautious. They refer to the EU, and the government remains silent itself, despite the fact the intensive suffering that we bear witness to. And don't get me wrong, Mr. Speaker, the EU's foreign policy work is important and cooperation is important, but the EU you can never use the EU as an excuse for Sweden to abdicate from its own voice, because behind the words we lean on the EU, there's often something else lurking, that you don't want to take a stance, that you don't wish to cause friction, that you don't want to be difficult. When the government weighs its words as if they are more dangerous than the violations themselves, then Sweden loses direction. And, Mr. Speaker, direction is something that's needed. Direction is daring to be clear when civilians are affected. Direction is being able to say, this is wrong, regardless of who is doing it. Direction is about sticking to the same principles in all conflicts, not just the conflicts where it's politically convenient to do so. It also applies to self-determination for Greenlanders, for Ukrainians, but also for the people of Western Sahara, for Palestinians. International law is not just something that you can choose when you want to. Either you support it or you don't. And then the world will rapidly become a place where might is right. Mr. Speaker, the Green Party wants a new foreign policy that enhances security through global solidarity, through international law, and through a fair and just climate transition. A foreign policy that does not kowtow, but instead holds the line. In concrete terms, this means, firstly, reinforce Sweden's presence around the world, not just our military or financial presence, but also our diplomatic and political presence. Establish relations with countries, movements, local players for change that are fighting for democracy as well as for human rights. Reinforce the key role of the United Nations by upholding international law when it comes to actions and resources, and condemn violations against the international wherever they are being committed, and promote peacekeeping actions, because it's always wiser, more sensible to prevent than to repair afterwards. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, put the climate where it belongs. In security policy, the climate crisis and the crisis of nature cause conflict, instability and migration flows. Adapting to the climate, reducing emissions, protecting biodiversity, these are necessary to enhance security globally as well as at home. This requires climate financing, it requires global targets, and as well as long-term rules for industry. Mr. Speaker, thirdly, we need to reintroduce a feminist foreign policy. Sweden shall defend the rights of women and girls, as well as their sexual and reproductive health, even when they are attacked by our ally in the White House. This means a broad approach to security that focuses on the security of people. It guarantees women's place at the table when peace is to be negotiated, and it ensures that Swedish weapons never end up in the hands of dictators. And it also means that trade policy must be fair and sustainable. Questions regarding corporate responsibility for human rights and the environment must be given a more central role to ensure that trade contributes to development throughout the chain, not just at the end of it. Mr. Speaker, there are many people who are concerned about what is happening around the world. That is when you need a government that acts forcefully with strength and signals hope. Hope is not naivety. Hope is building lasting institutions. Hope is standing up for those that are risking everything to write the truth. Hope is daring to say as it is when international law is violated. Hope is understanding that global solidarity is in fact security policy. The Green Party wants Sweden to be a country that makes a difference again. A clear voice for justice, with a drive that strengthens democracy, and with a climate transition that is fair. Mr. Speaker, that is how we can build security and freedom in Sweden, in Europe, and in the world. Thank you. Thank you very much. Fredrik Malm has requested, from the Liberal Party, has requested a rejoinder, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Jakob Riesberg, towards the end of his speech, said that we need hope and we need trade, as he says. Well, what is the Green Party doing in those questions then? The EU made a negotiated trade agreement with Singapore. The Greens said no. With Japan, the Greens said no. With Vietnam, the Greens said no. With Canada, the Greens said no. With Guatemala, the Green Party said no. With South Korea, the Green Party said no. As far as I know, the Green Party has not said yes to one single free trade agreement. What this is about is that the Green Party does not believe it's very important for people in South America, or Central America, for example, or in other countries, regardless of whether they're rich or poor, be given greater access to European markets. Therefore, the Greens enter into an alliance with different parties, far out to the left, far out to the right, with very strong agricultural interests to stop these free trade agreements. They say they're globalists. They say they stand for the environment and the climate, but in practice, poor countries are not given an opportunities to increase their welfare through trade. The Green Party has taken no notice of their suffering. The Mercosur has been sent to the EU Court of Justice. That means that every month, 4.5 billion euros will be missed in possible reduced customs duties because of the customs. Go ahead, Green Party.
Thank you. I think we have to differentiate between the matter and the process, because one thing, we have the Mercosur agreement and its contents, and then the second is how has it been negotiated and how has it ended up where it is today. And it has rounded national parliaments as well as European parliaments too. So, in this agreement, we see a possibility of companies suing the EU if the EU suddenly increases or expands its ambitions with regard to the climate or human rights or environmental issues. We want to know if that's true or not, because nobody has been able to clarify that thus far. We want to know whether it's true that if Ursula von der Leyen, if it's sufficient that Ursula von der Leyen signs this for it to be legal. So there are very many questions with regard to how this agreement has been produced. That's what we want to know. Is this how we should go about establishing new laws in the EU? And then as regards the contents itself then, that there are certain ambitions that are lacking that we take for granted in Europe. For example, reduction of emissions with regard to the environment, with regard to human rights. All this is mentioned, but only as should clauses, no shall requirements. And this is linked to how we can ensure that these rules will be complied with. And this is a very important issue and question mark. So then being shut out of the market, that's not true. That's not true at all. The EU is already today one of the biggest trade partners with the Mercosur countries. And this agreement will not make it easier for small companies or small farmers, because the text of the agreement and the requirements, I mean, these are thousands of pages. It's going to take a year and a half to translate to all the local languages. It's only major companies that will have the lawyers who will be able to look at this. What's required for us to do this without tariffs, etc. No small companies are going to be included. So there are so many questions on this. So I'd like to just hand over to you, Fredrik Malm. Is this true? Thank you. Fredrik Malm from the Liberal Party for the second rejoinder.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You need to separate, says Jakob Risberg, between the matter discussed and the process. But the Green Party do not do that. You're opposed to this agreement and you use procedural obstacles to block, together with a majority of those in the European Parliament who voted to refer this to the Court of Justice of the European Union because they're opposed to the agreement. These are forces which do not wish to see foreign competition. It's like the Customs Board in the 1870s in Sweden. If Jakob Risberg had been alive, then he would have claimed that we should have kept our customs tariffs for trade with the rest of the world. It's for Uruguay and Argentina and whatever country we may have where we want to have trade, because increased trade gives increased prosperity. But you fail to see this in the Green Party. You're happy to tag along with the separate interest groups to prevent poor countries to have an entry point into the EU. It's disgraceful, I have to say. Thank you very much. Final rejoinder, Jakob Risberg from the Green Party.
Well, arm in arm, that is nothing that has been negotiated with the left and the right wing at all. No. I mean, we're not saying that we're postponing this process ad nauseum, because the thing is, the minute Argentine ratifies this agreement, then they have to do this immediately. As soon as Uruguay does it, they can, in fact, trade without tariffs with the EU. So the process is not being delayed. It's just the conclusion, the signing of the major agreement, that is. There's every possibility already today to have trades without tariffs as quickly, as soon as you have ratified the agreement. And then, as regards free trade and how important it is, 18 months ago, we were standing here debating the free trade agreement with Chile. I was here, I was present, and Fredrik Malm was not. And there were none of the Liberal Party were here, none of the Moderate Party were here, no one from the Christian Democrats was here either, nor from the Sweden Democrats at all when we were discussing that agreement. So suddenly it's important to negotiate free trade agreements. Well, we debated it last time. You didn't even turn up, any of you. Thank you. That's the end of that round of rejoinders. And now it is time for Fredrik Malm's address. Fredrik Malm from the Liberal Party, please.
Tack så mycket, herr talman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On Tuesday, it's been 4 years since Russia attacked Ukraine, when the full-scale invasion began. Conclusions were drawn that Ukraine would have fallen within a few weeks. Volodymyr Zelensky was offered the possibility to enter into exile, but Ukraine has heroically defended itself with a straight back, and it is an existential war of defense waged by Ukraine. Vladimir Putin and his co-criminals are not only asking Kherson and Zaporizhia and other towns and areas. No, they want Ukraine to cease to exist as an independent state. Ukraine will become a parenthesis in history. Ukraine has been denied by Russia its right to define its own country. Russia denies its history and the Ukraine identity. When the war now enters into its 5th year, Mr. Speaker, they do so in an ever more uncertain world. The world order we toiled so hard to construct after Hitler and Stalin burnt and ravaged our continent, this order is no longer just challenged. It's being dismantled one step at a time. The current US administration sees the Russian invasion, hybrid warfare and destructive actions as mainly a European headache and concern. Think what we may of that, but that is a fact. And just as the foreign minister noted, and which we could see in the statement of foreign policy, the US is taking actions right now which damages trust. We need more extensive, tenable, sustainable support from Europe to Ukraine. At the same time, we're witnessing enormous progress when it comes to invasion and innovation on the Ukraine side, drone warfare, defense against Russian infiltration, attacks against depots deep into Russian territory by Ukraine. Ukraine will contribute greatly to other countries' defense capabilities. They developed technology as a consequence of the Russian invasion. Every Monday at 12, since the full-scale invasion began, I and Gunnar Hökmark have been every Monday at 12 o'clock noon, been involved in support meetings on normal story in Stockholm. Between 300 and 500 people meet up every time. We've over 200 meetings by now. And in every morning, we have 10 or so voluntary organizations that join us. It is quite incredible. It defies belief, Mr. Speaker, to see the number of Swedes who are working on a non-profit basis to support Ukraine, delivering ambulances, fire engines, electrical equipment, Russian anti-drone equipment, etc., etc., etc. So much more. This mobilization must be the greatest Swedish civil mobilization on behalf of another country since Stalin attacked Finland in the Finnish Winter War in 1939. And through the government and the Riksdag, we've allocated 90 billion so far in military aid to Ukraine. In addition to that, 25 billion in civilian support. Just as everyone else, we will need to do more, however. The shadow fleet, frozen assets, Belarus, third countries assisting Russia in importing components to weapons production, etc., and other countries circumventing sanctions. Mr. Speaker, the enormous brutality by which the Iranian regime has attacked its own citizens, its own people in the past month must be seen in its right context. Within a few days, over the course of a few days, killing tens of thousands of innocent civilians, shutting down the internet to make it impossible to communicate in addition. This is a killing which we need to look at to try and find corresponding levels to understand the extent of the brutality. Massacres of this order of magnitude in such a short period of time there are perhaps two clear ones in the 20th century. One was Babiar, when the Jews of Kiev were murdered during the Second World War, and the second, the Katrina massacre, where the Soviet Red Army liquidated Polish officers, also during the Second World War in the 1940s. And if we reflect on what the Iranian regime would do when they commit such crimes, what would they be capable of if they also had the world's worst weapon, nuclear arms? We can only imagine what they would be prepared to do to their own people if they also had control of such arms, because they become more immune to the potential interventions of other countries in such a setup. Nothing, Mr. Speaker, would be better for the Middle East than the fall of the Iranian regime. It would open up for the population, where many are well educated, almost 100 million people. It would give opportunities to the Iranian population to construct a democratic, secular state of Iran, where all groups would be respected. Persians, Kurds, Azeris, Baluchis, Armenians, Arabs, etc. And Iran could be a country which contributes to democracy and stability, rather than, as today, with the current Ayatollah regime, they try to put an end to all such developments. The Minister of Foreign Affairs clarified this very well, both in her address and in the rejoinders on Greenland. Sweden's position is very clear. We follow the Danish line entirely. And this is the only reasonable course of action, of course. In addition, we can add that Sweden also now continuously has deepened our commitment in favour of the Arctic region. And from that perspective, if there's one thing I have worked to promote in the Riksdag and my party similarly, I hope that the government and the Riksdag can make decisions very soon to acquire a new research icebreaker so that we can raise our level in Arctic research and in particular, considering the security policy and geopolitical situation, this is a necessary investment. A research icebreaker, Odin, today is mainly anchored in the port of Luleå. It's moving across the Cork region when in these cold days, but late spring and summer it may take off for excursions into the Arctic region. However, it is coming to its full technical end of life span very soon, so it is high time to adopt a decision on a research icebreaker. Thank you very much. Håkan Svenneling from the Left Party and Jakob Risberg from the Green Party have requested rejoinders to this address. Håkan Svenneling for the Left Party first.
Mr. Speaker, welcome back to the Foreign Affairs Committee after your little trip to the Education Committee, as it were. So I don't know how many... You've had a long career in the Riksdag and the committee, but it's great to have you back. And you're a knowledgeable person, and I know that you know a lot about the Middle East, for example, and Syria, which is what my question is going to be about. Because in Syria, after a long civil war, 14 years, things have happened very quickly with a change of regime, and we have a new government in power. We have the HTS, which is sort of slightly linked to the Al-Qaeda, but perhaps more independent, and they managed to take power from Assad in Damascus. Now, we've seen that they are pretty brutal, this new regime, against certain groups, the Druze and Kurds, etc., and they have been subjected to violence from the HDS and the governments and their military troops and linked military groups. So, in September, the Swedish government decided to change the support given to Syria. So it's also possible to give to public institutions. And this is fairly unusual because previously, the Liberals, at least I've seen, that you don't want to support states, you want to support others, other projects, etc., in order to achieve the goals that you wish to achieve with development aid. But the response that I received last week from Minister Dusa, he said that this was about migration, that it should make it easier for people to go back to Syria, not just from the region, but specifically from Sweden. So my question is, why don't we receive more information about this money, where it ends up? Is it the same as we've seen in Somalia, where we have the Somalia Gate, where you've given money to people close to the Somali president? So, I would just like to hear Malm's comment to this. Thank you. Fredrik Malm from the Liberal Party, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Syria. I have to say that I suffer alongside all of the Syrians, a country that has been tormented for so long. From Hafez al-Assad was in power many years ago now, the father of Bashar al-Assad, who then took over the reins for decades of oppression and persecution in this country, where then, well, as a result of the Arab Spring, in Tunisia and other countries, a civil war was waged, as Håkan Svenneling rightly pointed out, for a period of 15 years. And then it all happened very, very quickly. There was some sort of stability, was very fragile with the Kurdish-controlled area and the rebels near the Turkish border and some others controlling the area around the capital. And in just a few short weeks, the HTS, which is really an extension of what at the beginning of the war was called Jabhat al-Nusra, with link to Al-Qaeda, have taken over, and they were able to control Damascus. That's sort of a few entry points, though there are very central points, however. There are many people who fled Syria since then. I don't think we should oppose those who would wish to return, and that we give them better preconditions to do so. But the second point is that the foreign minister also mentioned in her statement that she's visited Eritrea. Sweden will, in the present world, been in a situation where we need to be able to have contacts with countries such as Syria for a number of reasons. There are many issues at stake that need to be dealt with, and I believe that you have to ensure that the regime in Syria becomes a little bit less extreme and vulgar, and try to build stability in the region. If you can work to promote that, I think that would be beneficial. Left Party, you have the floor.
Malmer inne på...
Now, what you touch upon at the end here, the Syrian regime and its sort of direction, orientation, well, it's a bit gives rise for concern. I mean, you have three different groups that they've attacked with violence, etc. And at the same time, you've opened up to support public institutions, and basically what you're doing is that you're supporting these attacks against these groups, minority groups, and so that's an extra. Problem. I mean, you have the Liberal Party in the government together with the Sweden Democrats, and we have a migration minister have included these aspects in migration policy. So, I mean, there's a balance to be struck there, and I hope that, Syria will be built up and it's going to become a safer place and more secure, etc., and freedom. But, you said that there's your own, you want people to go back to Syria, immigrants to go back to, and that's the goal, and then also supporting the state. So what's your response? Rejoinder from the Liberals.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would say that you need to look at the context. Sweden does not deviate in any way from what countries in our vicinity or the American continent or other European countries do. We need to try and find different forms to resolve the rebuild of Syria. And previously we had sanctions against Syria. We said that we would have sanctions. Now it's a new regime, and they're saying they want to rebuild Syria. Well, then I think the important point for Håkan and myself and everyone else is that we're very, very clear in setting the clear demands on the regime, the right demands. If we want to maintain relations so that there will be an increased opportunity to build stability for Syria, we need a lot of actions in Mecheta, Suvi, Aleppo, what we've seen against the Druze or others. This is under the responsibility. It's incumbent on the new regime to put a stop to such actions. That's my opinion. Thank you very much. That concludes this round of rejoinder. And Jakob Risberg for the Green Party has the floor for the next round of rejoinders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to welcome Frederick Malm back to the Foreign Policy Committee. Even if we haven't been in this committee together before, we've had quite a number of debates, and I appreciate this. I agree with the previous speaker that you're very well read and a very good person to debate against. Maria Leisner, previous People's Party member, stated previously that the Sweden, together with other countries, founded a democratic institution that has kept an eye on democratic procedures or institutions around the world. But since 2022, support for that idea has diminished by 75%. Sweden's aid should go to Sweden has been the opinion of the minister. In the middle of the 90s and onward, it was decided that instead of sending money to corrupt leaders, Swedish, tax money going to things we didn't really understand where they were going, it should be spent on building up democracy around the world. I thought that was very good. Folkpartiet was part of building this up. Transparency and democracy were important watchwords. But we're now basically cutting off support to idea at the same time as we're sending hundreds of millions of crowns to a corrupt anti-Semitic president in Somalia with dubious intent as far as the money goes. And I'd like to ask Member Fredrik Malm, what does he think of this as a Liberal, actually? Thank you. Thank you very much. Fredrik Malm, the Liberals, go ahead.
Tack så mycket.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for those kind words to begin with. Jakob Risberg, I have also appreciated our debates. And this debate has also been a good one, both to listen to and to take part in, I have to say. IDEA is only a few hundred meters away from here in Strömsborg, but I've been a member of the Riksdag for 20 years. I've never heard from them, never received a publication, and over the course of my 10 years in the Committee on Foreign Affairs, I've never been contacted by them. I find it very difficult to make an assessment of what IDEA have achieved, etc., etc. So that assessment and that issue should probably be put to the Minister for Development Aid. If he's here in the chamber, for example, would probably be able to give a better answer on the resource allocation or why there was a cutback. But of course, amendments are always made to the budget, the allocations for development aid, with considerable support that we need to continue to pay to Ukraine, not least. I see a continued need to make a number of very brave prioritizations. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to Somalia, furthermore, there are 2 points here that I think are worth noting. First of all, is it really unreasonable that Sweden, in our relations with countries who receive large amounts of money continuously, year in and year out, of the Swedish taxpayers' money, that we could have demands for something which is entirely reasonable, also in accordance with international law, after all, that these countries should be expected to welcome back their own citizens, their nationals, if they are no longer permitted to stay in Sweden. This has been discussed. We've addressed it with the Green and the Red parties. This is a reasonable part of a foreign policy which can serve the best interest of Sweden, that these countries who are recipients can also take back their citizens, their nationals, if they've committed serious crimes in Sweden. Nothing surprising or strange about that. Thank you very much, Jakob Risberg from the Green Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Member Malm, for the answer. I've just been in the Foreign Policy Committee for about a year and a half, but I was invited to visit it several times a few years ago. It was very interesting to work as an election observer. You work to strengthen democracy in different parts of the world, strengthen parliamentarians, but it's difficult for this type of institution, this type of organization, getting Swedish tax money to inform us what they're doing when the serious cuts have come out. So we do need to be able to ask them, though, what they're actually doing. Now, as far as Somalia, they should be accepting these persons that are returning, regardless of whether they get money from us or not. That's their obligation under international law. Should this be a condition? There's no reason to send hundreds of millions to a corrupt leader if he's not doing what he's supposed to do. Thank you. Liberals, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, as I said, I'm not entirely in tune with all the details and the specific allocations to specific recipients, such as IDEA. But the Green Party were in charge of the ministerial position from 2014 to up until, almost elections 2022, up until the election, for a period of 8 years, where they were responsible for the position of the Minister for Development Aid. So, Jakob Risberg, why don't you go to openaid.se and let's have a look at how much aid money Sweden allocated to Somalia during the course of these 8 years. I think it exceeds 100 million, actually. I think it's 100 million per 6 months, even if we look at this. So it's easy to say that this government is paying 100 million to Somalia, whereas the Green Party ploughed in hundreds of millions to the very same regime in Somalia and for a period of 8 years. I think it's only right to admit that that was indeed the case if you want to be involved in this debate. Thank you very much. That concludes this round of rejoinders. And the first part of the foreign policy debate is thereby concluded. And this concludes the interpretation into English at today's debate.
Då är det så att talarna får ordet om längst 6 minuter och på de anförandena så råder det fri replikrätt. Alla ledamöter och statsråd som finns i kammaren kan begära replik även om de inte har hållit sitt huvudanförande eller ens står på talarlistan. En talare kan få ordet 2 gånger i ett replikskifte och varje replik får omfatta längst 1 minut, totalt 4 minuter per duell. Anförandena, de hålls i talarstolen, replikerna, de tar vi i talarstolarna framför podiet. Och med det sagt så går ordet för anförande till Alexandra Völker, Socialdemokraterna. Varsågod.
Tack herr talman. 25 miljoner människor. Så många lider av extrem hunger i Sudan. I snart 3 år har inbördeskriget rasat i Sudan. Det som redan före det nuvarande kriget var en allvarlig humanitär kris har utvecklats till världens största humanitära kris. Omkring 12 miljoner människor är på flykt. Och utöver att nära hälften av landets befolkning lider av extrem hunger har svält konstaterats på flera platser. Områden där det tidigare odlades har förvandlats till rena slagfält. Den humanitära krisen förvärras också av klimatförändringarna som lett till extremväder som torka och översvämningar. Att humanitära kriser förvärras av klimatförändringar är något som vi ser på flera platser i världen. I Etiopien har klimatförändringarna lett till svår torka och brist på såväl vatten som föda. Samtidigt har också det senaste decenniet stora våldsamheter i flera regioner drabbat befolkningen hårt. I Afghanistan, där befolkningen inte bara lider av den brutala talibanregimen utan även av klimatförändringarnas konsekvenser. Afghanistan är ett av de länder i världen som är värst drabbat av klimatförändringarna och samtidigt minst utrustat för att hantera det. Trots ökade behov så väljer Tidöregeringen att dra sig undan de länder där behoven är som störst. Samtidigt som 1 miljon sudaneser flytt till Sudan, där befolkningen under lång tid lidit av svår fattigdom. Samtidigt så avskaffar regeringen det bilaterala biståndet till just Sydsudan. Och trots att flera svenska organisationer är tydliga